This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC for the final time this year, live and in your living room or your car or possibly your kitchen, maybe even the bathroom, but it's probably best if we don't think about that. Shall we set ourselves one of the hardest tasks of the year by way of a sort of valedictory nod? Would it be possible, do you think, to have a conversation about what is sort of officially termed as the Israel-Gaza war, confined only to people who are not heavily invested in either territory? I don't know if you can say side, because the war is, ostensibly against Hamas, and I have no desire whatsoever to speak to anybody ever who would describe themselves as being on the side of Hamas. But the Palestinian people, everyone should be on their side, including Israelis, to be honest with you. So that's why the word war sometimes doesn't even seem to fit the circumstances. But I am fairly confident that nobody would dispute, nobody honest or vaguely human could dispute the conclusion that the conflict has been a categorical, catastrophic humanitarian disaster for the people of Palestine. The terrorist atrocity of October the 7th was precisely that, an atrocity, a disgusting act of terror. But the minimum, I think, of 20,000 people who've died in the Gaza Strip since have to constitute a catastrophic humanitarian, well, could you call it an atrocity as opposed to a disaster? And there already is one of the indications, one of the explanations of why this is such fraught territory. But do you think it would be possible to have a conversation about this that is confined to people who come at it with perhaps suddenly no preconditions or prejudices, but also not much knowledge? I ask you this because I've been struck in the last few weeks by the number of people. So I've been out and about with the book, which means I've been speaking to you outside the studio even more than I usually do. And the number of people who have complimented us on how we've done the issue, how we've done the subject, people from all corners of the conversation, but the number of people who've thanked me for bringing them up to speed, for actually helping them to understand the issue. So we sit here with a presumption, because at the very mention of the Middle East, or Israel in particular, historically our switchboard lights up. Historically, it lights up in both directions. People who think that the modern state of Israel has pursued policies in Gaza and the West Bank that are absolutely unjustifiable and intolerable, and equally with people who believe up to a point that the importance of protecting the modern state of Israel, of enforcing the security and indeed the existence of the modern state of Israel, justifies the extreme measures that are sometimes taken by the government to coin a phrase, protect its borders. So historically our phone lines light up with incredibly invested people, sometimes invested to the point of I don't want to say ignorance, because it's as if, well, we took a call, didn't we, I think last week, and someone held incredibly strong opinions in favour of Israel. We very politely pointed out that most of them were wrong or were not built on facts. And I said at the end of the interview, I said, you won't change your mind about any of this, will you? All of the things that you've offered up to us as justification for your convictions, you now know are not true, but your convictions will stay exactly the same. And to his credit, I suppose, he said, yes, I won't be changing any of my opinions at all. So that is what I mean by a sort of a corrosive loyalty, in that you turn off your ability to see and hear facts, never mind arguments, because the emotional connection with the cause runs so deep. And given how many people have mentioned to me that they have no connections or affiliations with either Israel or the Palestinian people, and have had to rely upon news coverage to come to a better understanding of the issues, I wonder whether we can have a conversation that is confined to you. It'll be tricky. I mean, in a way, I'm telling people who care the most about these subjects not to ring in. It makes life incredibly difficult for Eleanor and Roxy, because people will probably pretend to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Objective wouldn't be fair, because that suggests that other people are subjective, but just utterly neutral. That's the word I want. Well, it's not quite the word I want, because, as I say, everybody has to recognise that there's been a humanitarian disaster or atrocity in Gaza. But if you don't have a dog in the race, as it were, would you agree or disagree with the observation that this has also been a disaster for Israel? You sort of think of the need for allyship internationally and diplomatically. Imagine watching what's unfolded in the last couple of months from the point of view of not knowing much about what's going on, and also, of course, not seeing the full extent of the devastation in the Gaza Strip, but being aware of the numbers, being aware of the nature, if you like, of this bombardment. Another example yesterday of a place to which Palestinians had been urged to relocate in order to stay safe, just being bombed. Hospitals now are almost non-existent in that region. The idea that a passionate belief in Israel's A, right to exist, and B, need to defend itself from enemies at the gate is increasingly inconsistent with support for what has gone on in Gaza. At least from where I'm sitting. It has been for some time, as you know. It's coming up to 10 minutes after 10. How does this look now to people who are not invested in the conflict? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. How invested, how affected are you? What is your opinion of what has gone on? And by way of a nudge, I think it has been disastrous now for Israel. Well, it's been disastrous for Israel because Benjamin Netanyahu has pursued such a violent program of civilian killings. I just my mind boggles at the scale of devastation, and I'm not even talking about the death toll. I'm talking about what will be left when this ends, because I think it's increasingly clear that it is going to end without any form of resolution. I think it was clear from the start that the idea of eradicating Hamas was fanciful, and the stated intention to rescue all the hostages was probably disingenuous. Certainly hostages' families in Israel remain deeply sceptical of that commitment. And of course, the most recent development in that specific context was the IDF's shooting dead of 3 escaped hostages who were waving white flags at the time. So incidents like that, and unless you are of the view that you will support everything that is done, up to and including alleged war crimes, you can't be supporting the shooting of the actual hostages that the entire military campaign was supposedly designed to rescue. So I'm going to try, and listen, it's 11 minutes past 10. We might have to change our mind at 20 past, because what I'm essentially saying is the more you care about this conflict, the less I want you to ring in. Because what I want to know is how it looks to people who are not that informed or invested about the history of the region and the Israel-Gaza current conflict. The number you need, as always, is 0345 6060 973. Latest developments include the UN Security Council moving closer to a vote on humanitarian aid. They have to get the resolution right insofar as the US won't veto it again. The vote has been delayed until today, having been in limbo for quite a few days. And the words that were causing the problems were about the ceasefire. The original draft called for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. The final version calls for creating the conditions for one. The rejection of calls for talks by Hamas earlier this week on the grounds that they would only sit down to negotiate if Israel stopped bombing Gaza has, prolonged the agony for everybody. But the movements in the UN and the public and reportedly private pronouncements of Joe Biden suggest to me that it is going to end with a cessation of hostilities. It is going to end with some form of ceasefire without the two objectives stated at the outset having been achieved. I worry that Hamas, rather than being eradicated, Hamas is possibly coming out of this stronger than ever, because where do all of the people who've seen their homes destroyed and their families killed turn next? So I think that could be a political and diplomatic disaster for Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. And apart from that, you sort of think, well, the hostages are unlikely to be rescued, many of them quite probably dead already. And if they were to escape or be released in an impromptu fashion and bump into the IDF soldiers in the area, then there seems to be quite a high likelihood they'd be shot dead on sight, which of course also makes you wonder what tactics the IDF have been deploying with civilians in that area all along. It's possible, I suppose, the unit that shot the Israeli hostages was rogue or acting in a fashion contrary to either orders or protocol or what everybody else has been doing. But you'd be hard pushed to really argue powerfully that doesn't at least hint at a broader tactical approach to the issue. So how does it look from where you are? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's coming up to 10:15. This will probably not work. I like to set myself, as you know, fairly high bars. I like to, at risk of sounding like a complete flump, I do like to try to recalibrate the parameters of phone-in radio on occasion. Telling people the more you care about a subject, the less welcome you are to contribute today is possibly a bridge too far. I hope not, because I really want to know what you, as someone who is neither invested nor especially informed about the context of this conflict. What do you think of the conflict? Is it possible that the humanitarian disaster in Gaza for the Palestinian people is going to be recorded by history alongside a political, diplomatic, and military disaster for the modern state of Israel? And I have to say that, even though it is the responsibility of the current government, history doesn't work like that. History records the actions of countries, not the actions of defined governments. The number you need is 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 10:16.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
18 minutes after 10. Special thanks to Jackie for bringing a smile to my face, even in this tricky territory. She writes, do I want my first time calling to be, hi, I'm Jackie. I'm a bit clueless about this whole Gaza situation, but funnily enough, I am tempted, and I do know what you mean. This is from Carl. Hi, James. Israel has slipped beyond the proportional response tipping point that Hamas's terror attack justified. The court of public opinion, this is Carl's view, remember, is now switched to the favour of the Palestinian people. Israel look like the continued aggressors now, and then some kind words about me for the Christmas period. But on the other side, I suppose, of the conversation, I don't fully understand this, but I'll read it out. James O'Brien's introduction to a phone-in on the objectivity of the Israel-Hamas conflict has in no means been objective, so anybody with no prior knowledge or siding will have his view. I think you're saying anybody objective will agree that it's been a disaster for Israel, but you don't agree that it's been a disaster for Israel, which I think, unless I've misunderstood you, unintentionally proves my point. And while we're on the subject of people unintentionally proving my point, Richard's been in touch to say another Jew-hating show. So the suggestion that killing tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian people might not make the Israeli government look good in the eyes of the world is, if you are Richard, that is Jew-hating. When the UK was sorting out ISIS and Al-Qaeda, James never mocked the UK and our brave forces about friendly fire accidents. I haven't mocked anybody. And the thousands of innocent Iraqis and Afghans killed by our forces, I endlessly mourned and complained about many of the things you describe, Richard. But if you have to cling to the idea that criticism of Israel's killing of thousands of civilians and destruction of the Gaza Strip, if you have to cling to the notion that that can only be done from a perspective of Jew hate, there's nothing I can do to help you. You know, even the most reasoned, compassionate and intelligent conversations on the planet can't touch some corners of the population. But again, thank you for proving it. 20 minutes after 10 is the time. Benjamin's in Basingstoke. Benjamin, what would you like to say?
I was pretty naive to the whole situation before this has happened. But wow, what a revelation, what an education we've been given on the state of the world, effectively. Because I'm a firm believer in any situation, you must try and look at the circumstances from your enemy's side, and that's just from my Christian upbringing, right? Love your neighbor, love your enemy, this sort of thing. Okay. So I always try and understand. Like I have this belief that no one's stupid and no one's like truly stupid and no one's truly evil. There's a justification or there's a thought process that makes us do stupid or unreasonable or evil things.
Yes.
So from that position, you try and look at, if I was hemmed in, I was just had the unfortune of being born, I'm not just being born in the Gaza Strip, and I've grown up there, and I just happened to have the misfortune of being born there in a time where there was significant political tension, and I was penned in what the former British Prime Minister called an open prison, and my earnings were limited, my family home had been taken away, and I'd been forced off it. And I was never offered, the traditional way that people would acquire land was through, throughout history, was through combat. I was never offered the opportunity to defend my homeland. It was subvertively taken from me.
Which is the because some people listening are going to be questioning your original claim of naivety, because you've automatically moved into a space where you sound quite well informed. That doesn't mean that you haven't become informed recently, but just to be aware of that. And who was the former Prime Minister that described? Was it David Cameron? It wasn't it?
I'm sure it was David Cameron that went there, and he was like,
in 2010, I think.
Yeah, so it's like, I don't think David Cameron's insane. So if he's gone there and he said, this is an open prison, it probably is an open prison. And I mean, as these things heat up, you want to get a little bit informed. So you watch a documentary or two and,
Okay.
And there is a lot of horrendous stuff that's happened. And just to say, I'm by no means a supporter from Hamas. I don't think you can have a charter if you've been effectively conquered. You can't have in your charter that your conqueror cannot exist. I like that can't work. It's obviously not going to work. But at the same time, like, I just cannot see through the hypocrisy. Like, if there was
whose hypocrisy?
Israel's hypocrisy.
Right.
If there was a terrorist in the government building in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know that. I'm just assuming there's a government building there. Would they be sending a Tomahawk missile through the front door? And
I don't think so.
Well, I think we both know the answer, don't we?
Yeah.
And if they wouldn't, they're treating other human beings different to themselves.
And to the argument that is all on Hamas, the fact that Hamas embeds itself in civilian areas, and it's often claimed, I think with some justification, that they hide in hospitals, or certainly they hide in the middle of civilians, and therefore if the civilians get killed, the argument we've heard a lot in the last 2 months is that is the fault of Hamas, not the people killing the civilians.
Oh, James, that is perfectly reasonable. Do you know what? Because that is true, the next time there's a burglar, I expect the police to arrest everyone in a square mile. I expect them to send them all to prison. Because it's better to catch one burglar than to allow 50,000 people in the square mile of my house to live their lives normally. So if that's the justification that we're going for, there's a criminal there. Next time there's a terrorist in the embassy in London, just send a Tomahawk missile in and just flatten Mayfair.
I'm not sure I can counter the points that you're making, but people are more than welcome to try. There's one phone line free at the moment on 03456060973. So in conclusion, for you, this has been a diplomatic or political or whatever word you prefer. This has been disastrous for Israel.
Oh, horrendous. I cannot imagine a state that can call itself free and fair, which has which destroys children and justifies it by, but we got a terrorist.
And just out of interest,
those hostages really made it clear for me, because if you're really trying to rescue hostages, why are you executing men holding white flags in cold blood? Why did that happen?
Okay, and in conclusion, your personal response to the accusation that your perspective can only come from a position of anti-Semitism or indeed Jew hatred.
I'm a committed Christian. The Bible says that the Jews are the people of God. There is absolutely not an anti-Semitic bone in my body. All men, I am taught from my religion, all men are equal before God, and there is no room for hatred to other man in my belief system.
Which is where you began, actually. Made me a bit embarrassed when you said that you don't believe anybody is truly stupid, because I'm not sure that I can come with you on that. You pray for me, Benjamin. But on the question of evil, that's closer to yesterday's conversation, of course, about the killers of Brianna Ghey. Thank you, Benjamin. That's the perfect start to the conversation in many ways. But everything you said is, of course, now up for criticism or critique, analysis by anybody else who's listening. That's how the show works. Fred is in Coventry. Fred, what would you like to say?
I think there's a lot of sense in what Benjamin said, but actually I would go a stage farther. I think the idea of a two-state solution is a non-starter. The whole thing was set up wrong in the beginning. What is needed...
Hang on, immediately, Fred, you've outed yourself as someone who is not uninformed about the subject. If you're going to start critiquing the feasibility of a two-state solution, then my polite request that we confine the conversation to people who've really been educating themselves since October the 7th.
That's why I was raising the point that I think a one-state
solution... Don't just gloss over the fact that you clearly were very invested in these issues long before October the 7th.
No, I wouldn't quite say that.
All right, well, I'll give you two sentences.
United Nations.
Because the phone line's awful. I don't know what was happening there. It sounded like that poor lady's rat, didn't it, in her attic from the other day. Roshni's in Battersea. Roshni, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. So I was completely uninformed before October the 7th. I don't have any affiliations with Palestine or Israel. I was living in my own little bubble.
Yes.
Until October the 7th, and then the atrocity happened, and I completely condemned what Hamas did. Yes. But I think the response to it is completely and absolutely disproportionate. I've educated myself completely since then. I'm not anti-Jewish. I'm not an anti-Semite, and I would class myself as an anti-Zionist. I don't.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that? Because I mean, for me, Zionism simply involves the belief in the right of the modern state of Israel to exist.
I don't believe in that.
You don't believe that it should exist?
No, I do believe Israel has a right to exist.
Right. So by Zionism, you kind of mean the ideology that everything done in defence of the modern state of Israel is justified.
Yes, and I think it's completely unjustified, totally unjustified. I mean, this has changed my whole mindset completely.
Really?
The way I look at things. So honestly, it's completely changed it. I was just a normal, 55-year-old woman of 2 teenage kids living my life just in my own little bubble. This has changed me completely. On Instagram, I do not follow any more celebrities. I don't follow anyone who is not a sympathizer with Palestine or a sympathizer with death, with the killing of innocents. I don't follow anyone. I now don't watch the news on telly at all. I used to watch the news all the time.
And this is all since October the 7th?
This is all since October the 7th.
Gosh.
Also with LBC, I now switch off on presenters who are just so pro-Israel. And there are a few, but you're the only one who isn't. And
I don't think that's true.
I just feel so angry, James. I feel so angry that
I am pro-Israel.
This is allowed to happen.
I am pro-Israel in the sense of...
No, but you also have sympathies with Palestine.
Well, of course.
You also have sympathies with the deaths that have gone on. Don't get me wrong. I am not completely pro-Palestine. I'm not completely pro-Israel, but I am...
It's proportionality that you're talking about, I think.
Yes, exactly.
And so again, for you... Israel have. It's just been disastrous from their point of view, because they've made in terms of the government and the policies, they've made an enemy of you.
They've blown it with me. They've blown it with me. They've blown it with my family completely. They will never. I mean, even when it comes to voting, I was a Labour voter, but now with Keir Starmer on board, I don't think I will ever vote Labour. So they've lost that vote as well.
So just calling for. I mean, you could move to Scotland and vote for the SNP, I suppose. But in terms of you want a senior politician or political leaders to be offering full-throated support to calls for an immediate ceasefire.
Yes. Exactly. That's exactly what I want. I want a call for a ceasefire, and I want the deaths to stop.
And I mean, the response to that would be, how would you do it differently? If there is a ceasefire, Hamas will be back and we'll have another October the 7th shortly. But I know that you know all this, and the question I'm asking today is whether or not what Benjamin Netanyahu's government has done will be to the detriment or the benefit of Israel on the world stage and in the hearts and minds of people like us. 10:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here with your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
33 minutes after 10 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. James says this text, just wait until your listeners hear about British atrocities in Ireland. And I'm just, for me at least, the points made by Benjamin made me think of Ireland. If the British government had pursued the IRA by, I think we can say, indiscriminately killing Irish Catholic civilians in parts of Northern Ireland or even the Republic, where known to be Republican strongholds, would there be a moral difference between what we've seen in the Gaza Strip? And I'm not a genius. I can't tell you when the point was passed that a response became disproportionate. And I know how hollow that word sounded to many people when we were talking about the need for and the justification for a proportionate response to the atrocity of October the 7th. But I can only work with what you give me. And at the moment, I'm not sure anybody's prepared to claim that what's happening now is still proportionate. But consider that an invitation to do so, if indeed you are. 10:34 is the time. Mike's in Whetstone. Mike, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. I think your last caller actually helped me to crystallise what I'm thinking about this, which is very difficult to pin down exactly.
Okay.
I'm really bothered about the fact that everybody is expected to take a side on this issue.
Yes.
And when she said that she is anti-Zionist, I could feel the heckles of all my fellow Jews rising at hearing somebody saying that, because they immediately hear anti-Zionist and think anti-Semitic.
Yes.
And as a Jew, I'm expected to take a side. I am expected to be on Israel's side. And the fact that I don't want anybody killed. I don't want anybody to die. I want there to be peace. It seems anathema to the people around me. I have to ignore so much content on social media these days from people who will only see what's going on from the Israeli perspective, because that's the way Jews have been brought up to think about the situation.
And the Israeli perspective is not the or a Jewish perspective, of course, but the conflation has caused you problems.
But it really bothers me that it's not. And we're all sort of programmed to sort of be very attuned to listening out for anti-Semitism, and anybody criticizing Israel is perceived to be anti-Semitism, and then you have to say, but it's only Israel, we're not criticizing the Jews. But actually, a lot of Jews do feel that way. They do feel that inseparability between Israel's cause and the Jewish cause.
I hear, and I don't know if this is for me to say, but I think sometimes that people who are anti-Semitic camouflage their bigotries and their prejudices in the language of being anti-Israel. The examples of that in recent years have been legion. But listen, I'm not tooting my own horn, but I think we have, possibly for the first time, between 10 and 1 on LBC in the last few weeks, we have managed not to take a side, not to pick a side, and that can annoy everybody.
And it absolutely does, and that's one of the things that really bothers me.
Yes.
Is that you've been amazingly balanced about all this, and then you get emails like that one from Richard saying, "Listen
a Jew
to
hater.
This Jew hater," which is absurd.
Yes.
And for me, I went on the anti-Semitism march a few weeks ago because I'm really troubled by the rise of anti-Semitism, because it stirs up that cultural fear that all Jews have. My grandparents survived the Holocaust.
Exactly.
It's ingrained into you to be on the lookout, I suppose.
Yes.
But the fact that I went on the anti-Semitism march means that people expect me to now be pro-Israel and anti-Palestine, and it just doesn't work that way.
Or if I may, to be in favour of everything that the Israeli government is currently doing. Because, you can be pro-Israel and supportive of Israel.
This is the thing. Of course, I absolutely defend the right of Israel to exist, because the reason it exists is because of what happened to my grandparents.
Exactly.
And, I absolutely fundamentally believe that there is a reason that the Jews needed a homeland. But that doesn't mean that the way the Israeli government goes about and has gone about trying to maintain that state over the course of the last 70 years is justifiable in so many ways.
So what do you think it has done to Israel's standing, reputation, whatever word you prefer?
I think it's horrible, because I think that they are just draining away support. And you hear people like your last caller who, I completely get where she's coming from.
Yeah.
I think she takes it much too far when she says, I'd never dreamed of voting for Keir Starmer because he's not calling for a
full and immediate ceasefire.
There's obviously political reasons for doing that. It's not necessarily about how he feels.
Yeah.
But Israel is losing the support of the rest of the world, and that's tragic, because I still fundamentally believe in the right of Israel to exist, and so many people don't anymore because of what's happened.
Do you think you'd go that far?
I think that lots of people do, yeah. I think I think that your previous caller wasn't prepared to say it, but I think that she, the way she feels about it now, she doesn't support. It's the nuance. We're lacking nuance in this. But when she says she's an anti-Zionist, fundamentally, she doesn't really think that Israel should.
Well, I'm going to defend. I'm going to defend her against that, because I hear a lot of people using the word in very, very different ways, and we did clarify what she meant. I grant you that it's unlikely someone would say on the radio that that is what they wanted, even if they nursed that thought in their heart. But I've done this a lot of times, and I've spoken to a lot of people, including, I think, Mike, people who probably would be in the category you describe, and I genuinely didn't think Roshni was. But I also believe you when you say that you think people have been pushed into that position by very, very, very recent events. And for any humanitarian, that's a disaster. But for a Jew, it's a particularly pungent position. It's a horrible thought because of the existential threat that underpins the Jewish existence and the existence of the modern state of Israel. Crikey. I'm going to read this from Paul in Taunton, because I think it fits almost perfectly alongside what Mike has just said. I was pretty naive about this conflict and have become more informed as it has gone on. I'm not a Hamas sympathizer. I believe they are a barbaric death cult with no regard for the Palestinian people. But I also think that tactically they have been very clever. They have recognised that the timing of the US election will place a limit on US influence over the Israeli government, and Israel have taken the bait and made many, many more enemies out of previously uninformed people like me. 10:40 is the time. Everything you're hearing is up for challenge, up for contradiction, up for analysis. Don't please ever forget that. Carol's in Brent. Carol, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. It's great to speak to you after listening to you for too long.
Thank
you.
There's no such thing as too long, Carol. How dare you?
It's been a long time.
Thank you. What a lovely thing to say.
I think I picked up the phone because I'm a person that visited Israel in my teens. I'm now in my 50s, late 50s, and I have very fond memories of that trip. I stayed in the kibbutz, 2 kibbutz and 1 moshav. I really adored their sense of family. I thought they were very beautiful people to look at physically, believe it or not.
Fair enough.
And over the years, I'm just a normal, busy person, so I haven't really followed it closely. The only thing I've really noticed, as I was saying to your researcher, is that whenever the wars come along, there always seems to be an awful lot more Palestinian dead compared to Israeli dead. But I picked up the phone today because I listened to a little bit of the reports. I mean, I find it just horrific. Yeah. And it was an LBC reporter just talking very briefly before I switched off the radio of a child who'd lost both of their limbs. And because there's no infrastructure, the infrastructure is breaking down. There were maggots crawling out of her wounds. And it was, my father died 2 years ago.
I'm sorry.
And I had this, just listening to that brief report, I had this visceral, physical, it's just the idea of a military operation on top of the breakdown of infrastructure around hospitals and people getting food and water and hygiene. Oh my God, it is just so appalling. It's so appalling.
I put myself in the position of challenging what you say, using what I imagine others would. I've heard people say, well, what would you do differently? Which I grant you is a fairly facile position in the context of morality, or remind you that in war, innocent people die, even in, especially in grim and heartbreaking circumstances that you describe.
James, I might have to come off the phone because I just find it so awful to deal with. But the only thing I would say, really from my memories of my trip to Israel when I was 18, 19, is that I just have higher expectations of the Israelis.
And that's a huge problem, isn't it?
The idea that they went through the Holocaust and then that they would visit that on another population, to me, I've listened to, every so often I do listen to Holocaust survivors, and one of the things I hear in their voice is this elevated sense of taking care of humanity. And I don't see that in the actions of the Israeli government at the moment.
And I'm grateful to you for specifying at the end there the Israeli government, because although history records the actions of nations, they are driven by governments. They are driven by individuals. And in this case, it is Benjamin Netanyahu. And, of course, his increasingly extremist administration. It's coming up to 11:15. I should just tell you quickly, because the producer is badgering. I know I've told you several times already this week, but I'm telling you again that Sheila Fogarty, Ian Dale and I have recorded a sort of Christmas special for Boxing Day that you'll be able to listen to first at 5 a.m. So please make sure you set your alarms now. That's 5 a.m. on Boxing Day. I'll wait while you set your alarm. Okay, and then you can listen to it again at 1 p.m. So Sheila, Ian and I keeping you company. I still haven't told you which of those two it was that somehow managed to get through the whole of 2023 without hearing hide nor hair of Penny Mordaunt's remarkable speech at the Conservative Party conference. And you know what? I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to wake up at 5 a.m. on Boxing Day to find out. It's now 11:45.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:47 is the time. I'm going to read you a message from someone I know and I can vouch for, but it's been sent to me privately, so I won't tell you who it's from. And indeed, they acknowledge in the first line that they're disqualified from calling in, as they could not be more invested in the issue. My whole family lives in Israel, and although I've been a Londoner for nearly 20 years, nothing made me feel more Israeli than October the 9th. Still, I think Israel has lost and is losing with every day this continues to unfold. Losing on the world stage, losing the prospect of returning the hostages to their families. I think 9th there is a typo. Losing the prospect of returning the hostages to their families, losing the battle for its identity and humanity, and losing on hope of living a peaceful life alongside neighbours that, at the end of the day, Israelis have so much in common with. I know this is, too, what Hamas was hoping to achieve. It's devastating that Israel, led by the worst possible leaders at this critical time, rose so devastatingly to the bait. That's the second time that phrase has been used. And listen, it's important to understand that the bait could only be set because Hamas don't care about the lives of Palestinian people. Or they consider the lives of Palestinian people to be justifiable collateral damage in pursuit of their cause, which is, of course, the eradication of Israel. That's why I found Mike's comments about the horror of feeling that you have to take a side so powerful and so moving, and it's why this message affects me so deeply, because it's true, I think, that the bait has been taken by Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, but the bait could only be set by people who don't care about how many Palestinians die. So the tragedy for the Palestinian people is that the Israeli government doesn't care how many Palestinians die, and Hamas don't care how many Palestinian civilians die. And I suppose that the support for Hamas in the Gaza Strip speaks to the desperation of finding yourself in that position, albeit that it's the most self-defeating and disastrous position that anyone could possibly hold. It's just where you end up in the absence of all others, I think. 10:49 is the time. I would be wrong to say that I'm enjoying this conversation, but I am grateful to you for rising to the challenge that I set you, which is having a conversation, if you like, detached from the demands for side picking that Mike described so powerfully. If you have the ability to observe objectively or impartially, how is this going for Israel? There's no debate about how it's gone for the Palestinian civilians, and there's a rather grim consensus that it's gone very well for Hamas. But how has it gone for Israel? 0345 6060 973. Shaz is in Kingston. Shaz, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on. So I've always seen events like these on the news and stuff, but I think after October the 7th, I really made an effort to get a balanced as possible view by just trying to understand the historical context. Okay. I read this book, The Birth of Israel by Simha Flapan, really good book. And I read a Palestinian book by The 100-Year War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. And I think out of it, one thing answering your question is how is it going for Israel? How is it going to go for Israel? That I think all of these events, 1982, 67, horrific incidents on both sides. But when I think of Sabra and Shatila, there were some other events. It dies down, and then I think the plight of the Palestinians, their suffocation there, it fertilizes another Hamas. It fertilizes these youths that have no opportunity, nothing. And the only option is to do something, which is horrific. And I really want to try and understand both sides.
I hear you, and we'll continue our conversation. It's important to remember that the massive majority of people don't end up in the position you've just described, where they feel they have no choice but to do something horrific. It's not true of 2.1 million people in the Gaza Strip. You know, it's true of 20 or 30,000 signed up Hamas operatives. But your point stands with regard to them, I suppose. Albeit that I'm sure, like me, you recognise the contempt in which they hold the lives of the people that they claim to represent. Otherwise, they wouldn't set the bait that previous callers and texters have so powerfully described.
Yeah, but I also find as well is that this polarization, because you used to have Jews living side by side with Arab Palestinians, and they all used to be in Palestine. And there's a lot of traditions where some Palestinians won't speak with their old Jewish friends before closing a business there. And this is from Palestinians I know, in fact, family there. So I find now going forward, I think we're still going to have this. I'm quite skeptical on how things are going to normalize, because they'll settle down. But unless we have a neutral standard such as international law to unpick this, as you say, Gordian knot of, you've got occupied territories. There's already there. Now, where do they go? You've got right of return. Where do all the Palestinians who want to go back home, where do they go? Yeah. Then you've got the borders. Is Israel going to give the borders that are occupied? I don't know. And then, and these are all international law precedents for how they can get to this state where there is a parity of how there needs to be this evolving, flourishing relationship between the Jewish and Arab Palestinians. And is it one thing? I don't know. It's very complicated. But there has to be a neutral and standard, which is either it's international law or a neutral body that can
and that has to be robustly imposed. So I think, reading between the lines of what you're saying, you and I think I feel the same, that both the people in Gaza and increasingly the people in Israel have been catastrophically let down by their leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the PLO, they had so much infighting, and that's what I've read. Poor leadership. But on the other side, from like Begin and Shamir and Sharon, they massacred people. And it came out in the Kahan Commission that they massacred people. And I'm like, well, that's in the psyche of people who felt the massacre. And look, there's plenty of amazing, beautiful Jewish people and beautiful Palestinian people, and they all used to get on. And it seems to be like it's like a South Africa, or is it an Ireland type of the Protestant
sectarian division that the leaders of sects thrive upon, while everybody else suffers. Tragically, sometimes without being able to see that they are victims of the people who claim to be their leaders or who claim to represent them. Thank you, Shaz. I trust you. I mean, you've been on a crash course because you know more about it than I do, and I wouldn't have included myself on October the 7th as people who didn't have the information. I don't have the investment, but I did have. I thought I had the information. Although this is historically territory where callers routinely know more than I do about both the history and the politics. And in fact, someone's picking me up already. Hi, James. What is the evidence of support for Hamas in Gaza? I thought I'd seen some polling, but I'll read out this message. They were voted in on a platform of being moderate, replacing an incumbent party largely seen as corrupt and incompetent back in 2008 or thereabouts. Gaza's now mostly younger people who didn't, of course, vote for Hamas. I think it's important to point that out. As far as I can see, those poor people in Gaza didn't want any of this. 10:55 is the time. I know that some people may not want to hear this, but nobody has contacted me today to claim that things have gone well for Israel. Nobody. You can call me a Jew hater if you want. That's absolutely fine. I think you're mad. But nobody claiming that this is good for the Israeli government or by association the Israeli people, and that breaks my heart. Michael's in Newcastle. Michael, what would you like to say?
I'm another person who had absolutely no real investment in the topic beforehand. I'd seen the odd documentary through the years, like Louis Theroux on the West Bank, but yes. I'd seen it, but never really gone any further. I'd obviously known that the Middle East had its troubles in the past.
Yeah, of course.
But I would say before the October 7th attack, I had, maybe on October the 1st, I had literally just finished reading Yuval Noah Harari's last book, the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
And the end of that book was basically saying terrorism comes from a place of weakness and only works when the powerful overreact.
Good Lord.
So I just finished reading that book by, obviously, a prominent Israeli author. And then October the 7th happened, and I just remember thinking to myself, don't fall into that trap. And then they categorically did. Of
a massive overreaction.
Yep, yeah, and...
Crikey, that's really poignant, Michael, isn't it? That you sort of closed the book and then watched Harari's warning unfold in real time.
Exactly, yeah. And it's the fact that as a people, as a world, when we know this, it's not something new, if you know what I mean. Like, we as the Western nations, we know when an overreaction does that it doesn't.
Was there a tipping point? I feel that's a really facile question, but we all use the word proportionate, and we all feel now that it has become disproportionate. And I remember pushing callers who were adamant that whatever Israel did would be justified, and I'd push them to provide a number that would be too many. And I don't, in retrospect, think that was the wrong thing to do, but I don't know where that number was. Did it become too many at 10,000 dead, or is it not even the dead? It's the devastation. It's the thought of what happens next. Was there a tipping point for you where you thought that has now moved from reaction to overreaction?
It's a funny one. I can't actually remember the point myself, to be honest.
No, nor can I.
I just remember listening to yourself. Really, like I got most informed by yourself over the weeks after the attack. And I remember just thinking, cutting off water and fuel. It just seems disproportionate, as you say,
without any real or without any compelling or substantive account of how they thought the people doing the things you described thought that it was going to end. Michael, thank you. I haven't read that book. I read his previous one, but it's on my list. And I have to add something really quite uncomfortable at the end of this hour.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. So, I'd like to pat myself on the... Well, I could finish that sentence there, couldn't I? I like to pat myself on the back sometimes. I know, it's a terrible habit, which I'm working on constantly. But I do, as I said at the outset of the last hour, which was a tough listen, wasn't it? It was a tough conversation, but I think an important one and a troubling one. But as I said at the outset, I do sometimes like to try and turn the traditional expectations of the radio phone-in format on its head. And one of the earliest ways I did that, when I found myself getting my feet under the table here at LBC, was by not reaching for the very obvious provocations popular among a more tabloidy type. So it would be the hang 'em, flog 'em brigade. I'm not being sanctimonious. When I started doing, I mentioned to you yesterday, my first job in broadcasting essentially was on a morning argument show, and I'd often make fairly obnoxious arguments. In fact, I think I'm very lucky. That YouTube and social media and clips didn't really exist back then, because I'm pretty sure that if they did, there'd be a whole host of clips out there of me making arguments I categorically did not believe in, because the requirements of the debate show format demanded that one of us held the opposing view to the one that actually we all held. You can check with Matthew Wright over Christmas on this, is that sometimes I would have to make arguments that were quite icky, and some that I meant as well, that I've subsequently changed my mind about. I thought that fertility treatment should be dialed down and more people should be encouraged to adopt, which was based on the fact that I was adopted, but now I'm also someone who's had fertility treatment. So you change your mind a lot about things. But in the context of the radio phone-in show, the idea that prison is a bad idea, you've got two attitudes to this. I don't think you hear it much anymore, thank goodness, but it'll come back round again. Everything does. When I started doing this job, it was a popular contention among, I'm going to say, very well-paid idiots. It was a popular contention that prison was a holiday camp. Do you remember this? They'd find evidence of a prisoner somewhere being given a slice of cake, or a youth offender being taken on holiday in the hope of getting them out of the environment of crime and breaking that cycle. And this was proof that if you obeyed the law, you were being punished for being obedient of the law, and that actually if you were a nasty little scrote, which may even have been a phrase I used once, if you were a nasty little scrote who spent his weekends mugging old ladies, then you'd be rewarded with a safari to Kenya. And prison, crucially, was Butlins. Prison was a holiday camp. And, it takes a while to start swimming against the tide. You just found yourself sort of thinking, prison, I'm pretty sure it's not a holiday camp. They've got televisions. You go, yeah, well, I mean, and this, remember, was back in the day when you had some time out of your cell. These days, I think it's commonplace for prisoners to spend 23 hours a day locked up. The idea that that's a holiday camp still persists in some corners of the lunatic media. I think for the new year, we need some New Year's resolutions. In fact, I might invite you to suggest New Year's resolutions for the show that we can pick up in 2024. You can text those. I'll lose track of it all, but you can try to text things you'd like the show to do in 2024 to 84850 if you feel so minded. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how can you improve on perfection? This is like asking people at the Louvre to take out a Sharpie and make some improvements to the Mona Lisa. But hey, you never know. We might stumble across some areas of potential improvement. But the idea that prison was a holiday camp I think that was one of the first things that I parted company with the traditional radio phone-in host on. I just thought it can't be a holiday camp. And not least because if you took 2 minutes to imagine what it would be like to be in prison, the first thing you'd think of would be missing people, wouldn't it? I mean, the fear of violence or sexual assault or something like that might pop into your mind, depending upon which films you'd seen most recently. But in the sort of cool space of contemplation, you just think about missing people that you love. If you are lucky enough to have people that you love in your life, and if you're not lucky enough to have people that you love in your life, then your life's already pretty bleak, and prison's only going to make it worse. So the isolation, it's why even sometimes you read about powerful people in other countries being under house arrest as if that's some sort of cushy number. And it's obviously a hell of a lot cushier than being in prison. But it's the isolation from people, or it's the being cut off from family or the outside world that constitutes the biggest part of the punishment. The privation, the emotional and social privation that constitutes the biggest part of the punishment. And then it means that when you start having these conversations in a way that isn't defined by decades-old tabloid bigotries and prejudices, you actually start finding stuff out. And what we found out was that prison doesn't work. Prison does not discourage people from returning. White-collar crimes, we would speak to people who'd committed white-collar crimes and had been banged up, and they found the experience so traumatic and so unpleasant that the already slim likelihood of them ever undertaking another white-collar crime had disappeared forever. But in terms of violent crime or people whose socioeconomic status had in some way contributed to their criminality, there was no way that prison was going to make a meaningful difference to the massive majority of them. And guess what? Police have now claimed that prison does not stop criminals from offending. The College of Policing has found that imprisonment resulted in increased reoffending compared with punishments in the community. And slightly contrasting with what I just said, this held true regardless of the offender's personal characteristics, the type of prison sentence, and the length of the jail term. It looked at meta-analysis of 116 separate studies and essentially made the case for the pointlessness of prison sentences, particularly short prison sentences. 54% of jailed criminals reoffended, compared with 46% of those who got suspended prison terms, community service, fines or probation. So it's not a massive difference, but it's certainly big enough to support calls for the essential abolition of jail sentences of under 12 months. Now, the problem you have politically is the Tories are presumably drawn to this because it would save money. There's two ways you can go on this. You can go down the American path. I thought this was an exaggeration. Do you remember we took a call years ago from someone who'd worked in the prison system in America? We looked them up, and I think they'd even written on the subject. They just happened to be here on holiday. And they had us on in the taxi and rang in on the programme. But they described a sort of a marriage between law and order and the prison. So an area that gets a prison gets quite a lot of jobs. So a prison in you think, you've read your Jack Reacher novels, these parts of rural America that are quite arid socially, not just meteorologically. You get a prison, but in order to get the contract for the company to build the prison, the local politicians have to pledge a certain amount of inmates, otherwise they won't make the money. So the company gets the money according to how many inmates it's got. That makes sense, right? But you've got to guarantee a certain amount of inmates. And the same politicians, because everyone's elected in America, sheriffs, judges, you're constantly coming up for re-election in some parts of America. So there are very compelling cases of judges sending people to prison who no way should have gone to prison in order to keep the contractual obligation that was signed to get the prison in the first place. So on the one hand, right-wing politicians could go that way, and we should be grateful that they, at this point in British history, cannot. And then, of course, in the other direction, they're saving money by not sending people to prison for short sentences. So you've got to be careful that they're not actually putting the population at risk in order to save money and, offer it up to billionaires in tax cuts. But this research, to me, looks pretty robust. And it goes further. It says imprisonment can actually increase the risk of reoffending because individuals are exposed to risk factors during their time in prison. For example, violence, victimization, increase psychological strain, and then when you come out, you are less equipped to stay on the straight and narrow. So we're going to go in the precise opposite direction from the one that we went in the last hour, when you could only ring in if you didn't really know what you were talking about. That's not quite true. You can rewind and check, because with Global Player, you're always in control. But this hour, it is going to demand levels of experience, but it doesn't have to be the experience of incarceration. It could be the experience of working in prisons. It could be the rather heartbreaking and harrowing experience of having a loved one sent to prison and concluding now, as you listen to this, that actually you think, sending him to prison did make him more likely to reoffend when he got out, as opposed to what prison is supposedly in part intended to do, which is to cut the likelihood of reoffending. So drawing on what you know, for whatever reason it may be that you hold this opinion, but drawing on what you know, why do you think that sending someone to prison makes them more likely to reoffend on their release than punishing them in other ways? Have a think about that. I think it's a really interesting question. And I look forward to hearing your equally interesting answers. The number you need, as always, is 0345 6060 973. Do you ever get little flashes of memory while I'm talking? Was it Chris Grayling that took away their books? Do you remember? He actually took... Good God! Do you know, by the modern standards of Conservative politicians, Chris Grayling wouldn't actually stand out that far, would he? In a world where Suella Braverman can become Home Secretary twice. But good grief, Chris Grayling was a canary down the coal mine, wasn't he? For abject incompetence, rising to some of the highest offices in the land, taking away books from prisoners. But anyway, the question is a straightforward one. The research, very compelling, substantive research, a meta-analysis of 116 different studies, shows that sending someone to prison, particularly in the context of shorter prison sentences, sending people to prison makes them more likely, not less likely, to reoffend upon their release. Knowing what you know, which has to be more than what I know, which is nothing, why do you think that is? 0345 6060 973. It's 11:15.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:16 is the time. These New Year's resolution suggestions are ridiculous. I mean, if I took some of this advice, I'd have no show left. I'm certainly not going to stop plugging my own books. I probably won't write anymore for a while, so that might just come in. That might just happen organically or naturally. I quite like this. This is from Jason. How about an advisory board comprised of some of your regular listeners and contributors? We could meet in the Red Lion or the Half Moon quarterly to kick around format and content ideas. I'd quite like that idea, like sort of unpaid production team. It'd have to be the Red Lion, though, Jason, which I think is where we last saw each other, because otherwise Angus would probably have a case for unlawful discrimination. 11:17 is the time. Why does going to prison make you more likely to reoffend? Steve in Woking will kick things off. Steve, what would you like to say?
Well, I don't think that's true. I think you get different categories of prisoners, yes. Sort of kind of prisoners. Professional criminals, which is occupational hazard. You get people who are addicted to sort of like drink, drugs.
Yes.
So, and when you go to prison, it's self-determination. I'm
going to have to nudge you towards the conversation that we're actually having. I mean, the research has looked at people. It's counted cases. It's found that 54% of jailed criminals reoffended, and 46% of those handed suspended prison terms or community service, fines or probation did not. So it's a question of numbers, not opinion. If you go to prison, you are measurably more likely to offend. So why do we think that might be?
Well, I imagine the people, the cities they've got are people who are addicted to drugs and drink. And if you don't take away the addiction of drugs and drink then they will reoffend.
Yeah, but the people not being sent to prison will be addicted to drugs and drink as well. I'm not really inviting calls to poo-poo the research by the College of Policing, looking at 116 separate studies and finding the conclusions that I've shared. I mean, listen, they might have all got it wrong, but it's unlikely, Steve.
Well, yeah, I suppose, you know, when you've sort of been amongst that population, you understand the population a little bit better than people that actually doing the survey, I would have thought.
No, because it's counting people. So here are two people, right? One went to prison and one did not. They committed comparable crimes. Why would the one who went to prison be more likely to reoffend when he got out than the one who didn't go to prison is likely to reoffend?
Well, if the one who went to prison had an addiction to drugs and it didn't...
Oh, Christ, the one who didn't go to prison had an addiction to drugs as well.
Well, then, how did he fund his addiction to drugs?
I don't know, Steve. But anyway, thanks for the call. Ben's in Lytham St Anne's. Ben, what would you like to say?
Hi. My stepson offended in end of 2018 and didn't manage to get to... Well, wasn't sentenced until 2021 due to court delays and backed up courts and stuff like that.
Right.
During that time, he went from... offending to completely turning his life around, set up his own business, plastering and joinery, was doing really well, and then was sentenced to prison and spent nearly 12 months in prison.
Oh, crikey.
He's come out and he's been out for just over a year, and he's like a shadow of his former self.
Oh, what a heartbreaking story.
It's like post-traumatic stress. He has no motivation, no self-esteem, sort of jumps when a door slams and stuff like that.
Sounds like PTSD, doesn't it?
Yeah. Whilst he's not offending now, he's not doing anything wrong, I can see a scenario where if he got in touch with the wrong people, that because he can't hold down a job. He's just a different person.
So this is a categorical disaster.
Yeah,
but for the criminal justice system, they've taken someone who'd already rehabilitated himself.
Yeah,
and I mean he hasn't reoffended yet, as far as we know. But he sounds. Go on.
We're doing our utmost to make sure he doesn't. But
right.
He's gone from being incredibly motivated to change because it was a shock to the system getting caught and going through all that.
Can I ask what he did? Can I ask what he was done for?
Yeah, he was dealing cannabis.
Okay, must have been quite a lot of it these days to get a jail sentence.
Yeah, it wasn't
really?
that much. I think there's an example made, and a lot of people were very shocked at the sentence. So it was a shock to all of us. He was being told that he was going to get maybe a suspended sentence or something like that, and then he was sent down, and he's never been the same since.
Gosh. And you obviously fear that he is more likely to reoffend now than he was the week of the month before he went in.
I think so, and I think that's due entirely to prison and prison life. I think it was hell.
Thank you, Ben. It's a specific case, isn't it? Because of that period, that lengthy period of time. Again, a consequence of cuts and austerity. If you ever hear anybody, well, the only time the Tories ever talk about courts is when they're condemning Keir Starmer for having appeared in one when he was a barrister. But the length, read The Secret Barrister on this. It is extraordinary what's been done to the criminal justice system. And even on an architectural level, some of the courts are uninhabitable, but the waiting lists are huge. And that creates a scenario in which you can rehabilitate yourself, as it were, and then have it all taken away by a prison sentence. 22 minutes after 11 is the time. Kieran's in Cardiff. Kieran, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First-time caller, long-time listener.
Welcome, mate.
I think a lot of it is to do with the networking that they can get with inside the prison. Obviously, they swap ideas, advices and stuff like that. Then they get released and their money problems or their drug-related problems and stuff like that. And because they've had the advice, they go out thinking, well, if I do it this way, I'm not going to get caught. And then...
What's your perspective? What's your knowledge? What are you drawing on?
Well, I'm an ex-prison officer
Okay,
myself.
no, fair enough. I just wondered.
I've talked to offenders over the years, and that's pretty much down to what I can conceive to be part of the issue. It's obviously not all the issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess it makes sense. You hear about it quite a lot as well, don't you? So, but okay, so do we turn that around? And if prison was even more unpleasant, then people would take less risks that might prompt them to be returned?
I don't think, in a way, if we make prisons more strict or stuff like that, it's going to deter them. I think that's just the way life is at the moment. I think the biggest concern
also they were full in the 19th century, weren't they, Kieran? So I mean,
I think the biggest issue is we haven't got the funding for rehabilitation.
No.
If you look at the prisons in the likes of Norway and Sweden, their actual budget for reoffending courses and stuff like that is so much higher than ours in the UK. It's ridiculous.
Norway's reoffending rate is 20% after 2 years, has 3 times fewer inmates than the UK. I think this is a per capita comparison, and prisons operating at a capacity of 73% full as opposed to 104% full in England and Wales. So rehabilitation is the key. And, the bottom line on all these conversations comparing us with Northern Europe or Scandinavian countries is always taxation. The taxes are higher there, but everything is better.
But then, in my view, I'd quite happily pay the higher taxes and stuff like that if it meant the country's safer and the country could run better.
If you could see the benefits of the money being spent more clearly, then the money would be handed over perhaps more happily, except, of course, that the media narrative is defined by people like Viscount Rothermere and Rupert Murdoch, who don't sign up to that kind of logic. A, because they're completely insulated from the consequences of cuts to public spending, and B, because they are completely committed to looking after their own cash. Claire is in Bermondsey. Claire, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Claire.
I served 2 prison sentences myself in the 90s, and I'm now a counsellor, and I work with women in prison. Okay. I work for a charity called Imaggio Day, and particularly for the part #SheMatters, and I deliver emotional healing courses, parenting courses, and what I noticed is that most of the resources to help with rehabilitation are delivered through chaplaincy. They're not coming from government.
Yes.
And when people leave prison, women, I can only speak for women, when women are leaving prison, they just don't have the support when they get out, and it's just so easy for them to go back into situations which are just less than. Most of the women that I encounter have just suffered severe trauma and chaotic upbringings.
So prison is just a pause then, because the circumstances in which they were led into crime remain the same on the outside, and they return to them on release.
Exactly, and it can be exacerbated. I mean, when Holloway closed down, all the women's prisons now are located outside of London. So if you're coming from from London, if you live in London, to visit your friends and family in prison now, you're talking about £30-40 on a train.
So you're just even more, and you'd be lucky if you get there. Stay at the trains at the moment. You probably spend the night at Euston.
Exactly.
How did you turn it around? How did you manage to break the cycle?
Well, I had an education, and I had a family, and I also had a lot of therapy. So I had resources, which a lot of people don't have. We do our best, but it breaks my heart. And I see people leaving, and they're so positive, and they're so,
Go on.
They feel like everything's going to work out, and then what's so sad, and what I noticed when I was in prison myself, was that people just come back. A lot of the women now as well, James, are not in prison for the same reasons that they were when I was in the 90s. I was involved with drugs.
Right.
And a lot of women were coming into prison because of drugs.
Yes.
But that's not so now. Most of
I'm losing the phone line, Claire, so just tell me what it is now in a couple of words. Mostly these days.
Coercive control,
Well, women are inside for coercive control.
Yes.
Right.
Well, they've been coercively controlled and been brought into crime.
Oh, I see. Sorry, I misunderstood you. So they're victims of coercive control rather than culprits. And yeah, okay. And that would be county lines, I presume, and stuff like that, where I mean, I know there's also involvement with drugs, but different in terms of consent from the experiences when you were inside. Thank you, Claire. It's coming up to 11:30. If you do read this, please keep it anonymous. My husband spent much of his teens and 20s in and out of young offenders and prison. He had an awful upbringing and home life. And the very first time he was sentenced, he figured this was better than home. So he deliberately reoffended in order to access a safe space. I met him when he was 28, and he hasn't got into any trouble since. That was almost 20 years ago. So again, you know, it might sound a little bit happy-clappy, but love is often an antidote to self-destructive and dysfunctional behaviour. If you haven't had any love in your life, you are unlikely to find it in prison. 11:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
31 minutes after 11. Staying on the subject of criminal justice, matters criminal justice. I don't know if you picked up earlier this week. I poked some fun at it. And I did a little moment ago as well when talking about Tory MPs. The Daily Telegraph continuing its decline into absolutely delusional behaviour. I can't call it journalism anymore. Tried earlier this week to condemn Keir Starmer for having done some barristering when he was a barrister. And I took it upon myself because I feared that some people might have either taken the dictation from Downing Street and joined in with this ludicrous hatchet job, or, you know, fallen for the idea that the Daily Telegraph was still some sort of trusted organ and believed that there can't be any smoke without fire. It literally condemning him, as a lawyer who rang into the programme explained. It was Adam, he didn't ring him, we booked him, Adam Wagner from Doughty Street Chambers, literally explaining that it would be like condemning Keir Starmer for having treated criminals if he was a doctor, and therefore required legally, morally, professionally to treat criminals. Well, the chair of the Bar of England and Wales, the chair of the Bar of Northern Ireland, and the dean of the Faculty of Advocates, which would be the Scottish equivalent, have written to the Daily Telegraph today to pick up on this. So just in case anybody is still labouring under the illusion that story should ever have seen the light of day, let alone be filed under, could this possibly be interesting or relevant? Listen to this. You report that Sir Keir Starmer, while at the bar, acted for some convicted prisoners who turned out to be entitled to be released from prison, along with the findings of a trawl of his cases. Barristers are professionally obliged to accept properly remunerated cases within their competence and for which they are available. Our code of conduct expressly prohibits a barrister from declining a case because of the barrister's opinion of the client. We call this the cab rank rule. This rule promotes access to justice and reflects the fact that the role of a lawyer is to advise and represent their client, not to judge their client. Judging is for judges or juries, not for us. The idea that barristers, or in Scotland advocates, should somehow be associated with the causes of those whom they represent is therefore misconceived. Happy to clear that up. They were back at it again this morning in the Telegraph, trying to blame Sadiq Khan for some SUVs or 4x4s not being sent to Ukraine at the request of the mayor of Kyiv, Vladimir Klitschko. And of course it's turned out that actually Khan can't send anything to Kyiv, even if he wanted to, because of a law that is in place. Therefore it all hangs upon the government, but it didn't stop various media outlets from trying to malign the mayor of London for that state of affairs. So there we go, just a little side order of criminal justice related matters. Let's get back to the question of why prison doesn't work. Donny is in Dunkfeld, in Perth and Kinross. Donny, what would you like to say?
Hi James, how you doing?
Very well.
First time, be gentle.
Of course I will. It's the only way I know.
Because so I've worked in the criminal justice setting here in the community criminal justice team for a few years now, and I think that when somebody is before sentence, there's a criminal justice social work report, and part of that is a risk assessment that looks at what we call criminogenic needs. So that might well be, if there's substance use present, it might be alcohol use, it'd be relationships, It could be what was present in their offending behaviour, etc. The reason for that is so that we can form a plan of support and work with that individual. And the sheriff then decides whether or not they're going to impose custody. If they impose a community order, in Scotland we have community payback orders.
Yes.
That could be a year, 2 years. Then we set in place that programme of support and work. And I think that in prison, you may well do group work, you can do some focused work in the prison environment, but the problem is that you don't get a chance to put that into practice. So, because you're living in a completely kind of false environment.
Of course, it's like teaching someone to swim without ever letting them get in the water.
Yeah, they in the prison system, I mean, you're living by a completely different set of social rules in that kind of microcosm in the prison. And in a community-based setting, then, you go away and you try and put these new kind of strategies into place and use them, and then you come back and you meet with your social worker the next week and you have a discussion about, how you're finding these kind of new. It's all about strategising and about different problem-solving skills.
You put it like that, it sounds bleeding obvious, and yet, it's still headline news when the College of Policing finds that prison increases reoffending. And the answer to the question is just you just flip around what you've just told us, don't you? If you're in prison and you're not doing any of these things, then when you get out, you're more likely to slip back into your old ways.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about what we're starting to understand and learn about trauma, and then we really start to realise just how out of kilter and out of touch the penal system is, but that's a whole other phone-in.
It is a whole other phone-in, but knowing what you know and doing what you do, what advice would you give to Ben about his stepson? I don't know if you heard the call. He was...
I didn't hear the call, sorry.
So he was... it took 3 years for the case to come to court. Cannabis dealing, not massive amounts. Everyone was very surprised when he got a custodial sentence. But during those 3 years, he turned his life around. He essentially rehabilitated himself. And since he's got out after a year, he's got what sounds a lot like PTSD, and they're terrified he's going to fall back into his old ways. Prison has done the opposite of either preparing him for a return to society or helping him to turn his back on criminality. It's a bit of a cheeky question, really, because you didn't hear the call. But in those sort of circumstances, what can family and friends do to help?
There are some really, really kind of horrible examples of just how rigid the criminal justice system can be.
Yes.
And on the individual case-by-case examples. And the only advice that I would take personally as well as give out would be just be as supportive as you can be and be there for them. That's all we can do.
Yeah. Fair enough. I get it. I mean, literally love and support. And of course, the people who haven't got loving family in their lives are going to be the people probably most likely to slip back fastest into whatever it was they were doing before. Thank you, Donny. It's 11:38. It's a PRB is in Westminster. What would you like to say?
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, what I wanted to say was I've got a stepbrother, and since the age of 13, he's been reoffending, and he's spent more time in prison than he has in the outside world. So he's 33 now.
Crikey.
So, yeah. So the problem is, it's the mindset. You got to remember, think of a baby. If a baby's at home making mess all day, that's all the baby knows, or a footballer. If you send a footballer on the pitch, he gets a red card, it doesn't mean he's not going to be able to go training on Monday and, he's not going to be around the other football players. So once you send someone with the same mindset into an environment with people that all have the same mindset, all that's going to do is keep everybody thinking, we're in here. It's not going to make for an example, if you gave him an 8-hour shift at a workplace and said, look, this is your sentence. You've got to go to work and, after work, you've got to go straight home, and you give him chores like that. Then he's going to change his mindset because you're opening him up to a different world.
But instead, you're just dipping him in and out of the same two worlds, one when he's in prison and one when he's outside doing the things that will get him sent to prison. Does he try? Does he try to go straight when he gets out or and then slip back slowly?
Better. Huh? He doesn't know any better, because that's why I said it's like the baby effect. A baby doesn't know until you teach them.
Yeah.
So it's all about the mindset, really. You have to change the mindset. The difference between you and a reoffender is that you said, you know what, I'm going to work. I want to be a radio presenter. and you did everything in your will to get there. And it's the same effect with them. They say, you know what, I need to eat today. I'm going to Tesco's and I'm walking out with that sandwich.
So, yeah, a sort of poverty of aspiration, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and you could be rich and still be an offender. It's not literally dependent on your income. It's literally your mindset.
So have you given up on him? I mean, because you can't break that cycle from the outside. You can only really break it from the inside. And if the help's not there for him, then this is just going to carry on for the rest of his life, isn't it?
Well, you know what? To be honest with you, it's him. He has to change his mindset. Yes. I'm a motivational speaker. I go under the name of PRB.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've also got a charity called The Art Don't Stop that tries to help reoffenders and youth coming up and help them not to reoffend. But what the problem is really is you need to put them in a mindset. Motivational speaking will help you. You play a few motivational tapes and help you change your mindset. You'll do it. It's what you're listening to, what you absorb. What goes into your brain is what you express. And, you know, most of the time, there's nothing but crime on TV. Wake up on the news, there's a whole load of stuff going on. So you're trapped in that world.
You've got to get yourself into new spaces so that you can have new ideas and new aspirations. Thank you, PRB. That's tough, that, actually, to watch it, to know what help looks like and to be unable to actually affect it in the life of someone that you care about, someone that you're related to. It's coming up to 11:42. Ashley's in Harlow. Ashley, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. I'm a financial prosecutor. I prosecute primarily economic crime. And so I don't have a great deal of experience once people go into prison as to what happens at that stage, because that's really when I'm done with them. But
right.
I do have a perspective of what I think could happen. And it's in the context, and the example I have is shop theft. There's an endemic in shop theft going on at the moment.
Yes.
And when people are prosecuted in the magistrates' court, they're either given a short custodial sentence or they're given a suspended sentence and a rehabilitation requirement.
Yes.
And when I see people, tens and tens of people, all of the time in court, they're brought before professional people, prosecutors, defence solicitors, judges, and most of the people I come across do want to change their life around.
Right.
They don't want to be in this cycle. And they're told by all of these people that what they've done is wrong. And if they're given a suspended sentence, that's usually accompanied by 10, 20, 30 hours of rehabilitation requirement, drug addiction requirements to go and help treat them, all the different things that the court can impose, as well as unpaid work, which helps bring them back into society, make them feel a part of society of what they're doing. Whereas if they're sentenced to a 2-week custodial sentence or a 7-day custodial sentence, the court considers, well, we've done our job now, that's all we have to do.
Washing our hands.
And they get no assistance. And it's the reverse side of when a police officer goes to a supermarket and they're called to a shop theft. And they think, well, there's nothing we can do here. So this is our experience. They pick people up, drive them around the corner and let them go and say, don't do it again. And they're effectively telling these people, we can't even be bothered to deal with you.
Yeah.
But when you do prosecute them and you bring them before the court, all of these people are there saying, what you've done is wrong and this is how we can help you. And I think that's probably why there is a difference between people reoffending.
I think we could probably remove the probably from that sentence, couldn't we? I mean, it sounds like a pretty watertight analysis. I'd add one thing, and it's not particularly... Well, it's something I'd just forgotten to mention earlier today because it was one of the contenders for one of our phone-in topics. But you mentioned shop theft. We've talked a lot about shoplifting and walked the sort of tightrope between crime and necessity. Not that necessity ever justifies or excuses crime, but it does explain it. If I asked you, Ashley, just as and this is a complete ambush, so by all means hang up and pretend you haven't heard me. How many patients do you think were admitted to hospital in England and Wales last year with malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies?
God, I couldn't imagine. You'd hope very few.
You would hope very few. You wouldn't know where to start on a question like that, would you? Especially not live on national radio when you rang in on a completely different subject. So I shall spare you any further discomfort and tell you that the number is 800,000. What are we, the 6th biggest economy? Still? 5th, is it? 800,000 patients admitted to hospital with malnutrition and nutritional deficiencies. That's up threefold on 10 years ago. Just 10 years ago, of course, we were 3 years into austerity. That's extraordinary. And, you know, the devastating health impact of food insecurity. There'll be various reasons there. There'll be poverty and there'll be ignorance. And there may even be supply issues, as in, you know, the increasing difficulties of getting healthier food and therefore eating unhealthy food just to feel full. But there we are. It's coming up to 11:45. An interesting little story for you next. I don't know how aware you are of the legal levers that Michelle Mone pulled in order to try to silence journalists keen to report upon her association with the company that secured a very, very lucrative PPE contract from the Conservative government, while she, of course, was a member of the House of Lords as a Conservative peer. But legal letters are threatened. I mean, you know, legal threats are not pleasant. And she sent out quite a lot to journalists who were keen to report upon things that she has subsequently admitted were completely true. Well, one newspaper is planning to somewhat turn the tables on Michelle Mone and sue her back. We'll speak to the founder and editor-in-chief of that newspaper after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:48 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, you know, it's a weird thing to be threatened with legal action as a journalist, because you sort of have a little bit of nothing to hide, nothing to fear going on in your mind. But also, depending on the wealth and power of the people issuing the legal threats, you have that sense sometimes of being silenced despite the fact that you're fairly confident in the story that you're working on. This is something about which Matt Kelly, the founder and editor-in-chief of the New European, knows rather more than I do, because it was indeed Michelle Mone who essentially instructed solicitors to persuade you to stop reporting on her alleged, we don't have to say alleged anymore, do we? Her proven and admitted involvement in the MedPro company that received a big contract. Go on. Sorry.
What's actually even more invidious is that by this time she'd run out of solicitors, is my theory. So she was sending us email threats from her personal email, Michelle at ... And I was responding to these threats of defamation saying, well, dear Michelle, blah, blah, blah. And I would get these notes back saying, this is not Michelle, this is the in-house legal team. And I would say, what, they all share your personal email? Yes, they do. And we don't have to tell you who we are and all of this. But the nuts and bolts of it was we ran a front page with that now famous photograph of her stood on the Lady M yacht, which was a yacht that Doug Barrowman, through a third company, bought about 8 months after getting 65 million quid profit from the MedPro deal. And it was also a yacht, I should say, that she had tweeted a photograph on Instagram with the caption saying, business isn't easy, but it is rewarding. Okay, so fairly confident that we could assume that this yacht had something to do with it. And the next day, so we printed the photograph under the headline, Stop This Boat, and suggested that this was where Rishi Sunak might like to turn his attention if he wanted to clamp down on corruption in public life. Next day, to my astonishment, get this legal letter, pre-action legal letter for defamation, withdraw all copies of the newspaper from sale, apologise publicly, take the article down online, pay us damages to a charity of our choice. Now, the problem is, I know that there's no danger of a defamation case there's no libel judge on the land who would look at that and say your reputation has been damaged by what they've done, because it's all true.
But also you have implied that she owns a yacht.
Yes, exactly. How is that defamatory? How's that defamatory?
No.
But the reality is, when we're a small independent newspaper, we haven't got an in-house legal team.
Yeah.
So we have to send this on to a lawyer, and we accrue thousands of pounds.
And the meter starts ticking immediately. Immediately.
What normally happens in organisations is that you just swallow that.
Yeah.
But when she came out and she did this faux documentary, and they were still moaning about this front page on this documentary, and then she did that interview with Laura Koonsberg on the BBC, to start with, I got really irritated, and then I got really, really angry, and I thought it's absolutely wrong that very wealthy people can just fire off legal letters to organisations trying to stymie honest reporting into their affairs. And the truth is, there's a bigger picture. It's not just Michelle Mone doing this. There's a pattern of people, wealthy people, just fire these letters off willy-nilly. Michelle Mone sent dozens. She even sent a letter threatening a Scottish newspaper for defamation for suggesting that she had made up that Albert Einstein used to live in her old flat in Glasgow. Albert Einstein's never lived in Glasgow. They reported that. She threatens them for defamation. So she's lost touch with reality. But I did think something has to stop here. There's got to be a penalty.
Just for people not immersed in this world, often the instruction is from executives to make it go away.
Yeah, right.
Not to fight it or to win or to so I'll see you in court. We like the Hollywood idea of I'll see you in court. But just make it go away.
Yeah.
And then they start negotiating about what you will write in the paper or what you will say on air in order to ensure that the wheels of legal action stop turning. And
That's right.
You kind of you're pushing back against that now.
Well, because we think that, and you're absolutely right. The first inclination is, oh God, this is possibly really, really expensive.
Yeah.
Because you don't know the mindset of the people. You know, if the mindset is we're going to put these people out of business because we're so full of a sense of impunity that any kind of threat to us, we're indignant about it. We've got so much money, we'll put them out of business. So you do sort of think, well, let's just go quiet. Let's see if we can appease her, you know. But we're not in the business of appeasement, thankfully. I've got enough experience of libel law to know when I'm on safe ground. And also, a little bit of me would have relished a lawsuit against a defamation claim, because once you get these people into court, obviously disclosure opens everything up. I'd be confident and that they would lose a defamation case. But I was very happy when the Good Law Project came to us and said, we're interested in your idea that there should be a penalty. We think there is. So with the Good Law Project, we've now instructed solicitors and a barrister, and we're going to do it. You know, if she thinks,
get back the money that you had to spend in order to deal with the original threats, the original legal threats from her.
It's several £1,000s. That's all. It's not hundreds of thousands of pounds. And I should say also, James, just so that we don't lose track of our reality.
Yes,
this is a sideshow compared to the main indictment against these people, that they fleeced the Treasury of 60 million quid. And it's also a sideshow to the incompetence that the government displayed in allowing them to fleece and enabling them to fleece.
Well, the fleece is still in the realms of allegation, as you know.
But my subjective view on that would be that a 30% profit margin on a deal of that magnitude is just beyond belief.
Well, that's a moral judgment that actually our friend Carol Vorderman has made as well, that when that crisis began to unfold, some people saw a tragedy, and some people saw an opportunity.
Totally.
I think that's not an allegation.
What must never be forgotten is that PPE MedPro didn't exist before the crisis. And I saw on Twitter the other day a British businessman who had a UK company, 1,600 employees, been involved in the importation of PPE forever. They won £14 million worth of contracts. PPE MedPro, that didn't exist until they put this consortium together to rush through these contracts, got £202 million of contracts.
As you say, that's the main story. We were taking calls off people with decades of experience in various fields who couldn't even get their phone answered. We took a call, Matt, I should have phoned you at the time, actually. It was a good story, this. From a woman who had ventilators.
Wow. Which were gold dust.
Which were going spare because, they'd been due for export, but the export rules had changed. So she had, I think, half a dozen ventilators.
Crazy.
And she couldn't find anyone to talk to. People were not returning her calls. She was sending emails into the ether. But, of course, if she'd been a Conservative member of the House of Lords, she could possibly have sold non-existent ventilators on the promise that they'd knock them up next Tuesday.
100%. That's exactly that's the correct analogy.
So, I mean, the Good Law Project have clearly concluded that you've got a fairly strong case.
Well, funnily enough, since we went public with this, we've had a number of inbound inquiries from people who know media law inside out, some very big names, who are saying we're 100% with you. And the idea would be to try and establish a precedent in law where people who do send these spurious threats of defamation out understand that they will go to court, they'll have to explain the truth behind those threats, and they could be penalised for the costs we've incurred. And our meter is now ticking as well.
Yeah, because you describe it as, in the newspaper, a free hit. High net worth individuals cannot be given a free hit against media organisations or campaigners to silence their reporting.
And do you know, there's a human level to this as well, which is that it feels like bullying. And I hate bullies. And it feels like when people decide to just fire out cut and paste defamation suits, they've got a bullying mindset. And I think that, like you said earlier, there are certain organisations, probably the bigger organisations, where they can't be bothered to fight it because it's just not in their interest. But it is in our interest to fight it. And we will fight it.
Well, good. I've got a couple more minutes with you, so we should talk a bit about the newspaper. Born, of course, in the heady days of the immediate aftermath of Brexit. Were you expecting it to still be around? I'm just looking now at the next edition, December the 21st of January the 3rd, 2024. Were you expecting it to be around in 2024?
I wasn't. No, we launched it 9 days after the referendum as a pop-up anti-Brexit newspaper. You
must feel pretty silly now, what with Brexit going so well.
I know, what a fool! Who'd have thought it?
You and me both.
What a fool! And that sense of bewilderment about Brexit and its supposed benefits is still at the very core of it. But it's quite a broad paper now. Basically now, when I describe it, it's fighting right-wing nationalism. That's what we're really against. Because I think Brexit was an output of right-wing nationalism. And there's so much work to do. And I think 2024 is going to be an enormous year for us, for all of us interested in politics. It's going to be quite an existential turnaround for a lot of people.
I think it's fair to say that, actually. Matt Kelly, founder and editor-in-chief of the New European, which is weekly. You can buy a proper paper.
At a newsagent.
At an actual newsagent.
Or you can subscribe, folks.
Yes, indeed, you can subscribe. Are you still getting a free copy of How They Broke Britain with a subscription, or have we got rid of all of those?
No, we might revisit that idea, James, in the
probably
new year.
should mention that, actually. But there's probably some rules that we're dancing around.
Yeah, no, but we might revisit that giveaway as a subscription offer, so hold fire.
I shall hold fire on that. And good luck with this case, because we've all been there, and even supportive employers sometimes just think that the inconvenience and the publicity of a legal battle is not worth the principle of preventing people from telling porkies.
I think hitting back at their sense of impunity is very important.
A sense of impunity. In all good newsagents now, and even mediocre ones, the New European newspaper. It's coming up to 12 noon. I think next we'll allow ourselves a little bit of a relax, shall we? On a final topic of 2023 together, and we'll look at which of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges has turned out to be the stupidest. And I don't think it's as obvious as you may initially suspect, and I shall tell you why, and indeed what my favourite is, after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12 is the time. Well, what a strange year it's been. It sounds like a pre-recorded Christmas special, doesn't it? What a strange year it's been. Particularly in the realm of politics, where Rishi Sunak briefly looked as if he would mark a departure from the corruption and incompetence that had typified previous administrations, and then appointed Suella Braverman back to her role in the Home Office and confirmed the worst fears that he proved to be at least as bad, if not worse, as his predecessors. And of course, I don't know what you do. Is it what do you think defines Rishi Sunak? Is it 5 pledges or 7 bins? 7 bins or 5 pledges? And this is what he bet the house on. The 5 pledges that he would achieve in 2023. He said he would halve inflation, which I think he probably has, hasn't he? Using the measures that they chose to use. But that was the one that everybody said was going to happen anyway. That was the pledge to halve inflation that had rocketed largely as a consequence of energy prices rocketing as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. He said he would grow the economy. As you've seen, the latest reports today have got GDP dipping in the 3rd quarter, so we won't know for sure whether he has grown the economy until the 13th of February 2024, but it is hard to imagine a worse end to the year for him than today, which is sort of the end of the working year. And he will be reading in his, I don't know where he is, in Richmond or in Downing Street. He will be hearing all over the news and reading everywhere that he is currently presiding over a country that went into negative growth in the last quarter. Things were even worse than originally feared. He said debt would fall. It's not. It is currently rising. It's getting close to 100% of the size of the economy. I've got the figures from October. I mean, there may be more recently published figures. He said he would cut NHS waiting lists. How does that feel? How do you think that's going where you are? The grimmest story I think I've read this month, and it was so grim, and I probably shouldn't do this. It was so grim that I think I didn't even tell you about it on air. The producer's eye was caught by this. Eleanor was quite upset by it. The idea that one of the reasons why some waiting lists might be coming down is because the people on them were now dying. They'd been on the waiting list so long. So I don't know that one has gone well. NHS waiting lists. And then finally, stopping the small boats, which I need to accompany that reminder of that so-called pledge by telling you that today the claims about the situation in Rwanda are being rejected by dissidents from Rwanda. Rwandan dissidents living in the UK who have received police warnings over assassination attempts from the African country's agents have spoken of their shock and dismay at Rishi Sunak's insistence that it is a safe country. Political opponents of the Kagame regime living in London have described Sunak's claim that Rwanda is safe as unbelievable. So we put stopping the boats down there as well. So what have we got? Let's just recap on this before we get stuck in. We have got debt falling, economy growing, and inflation halving. Now, this doesn't automatically lend itself to a light-hearted phone-in, so we won't spend all of our time in the shallow end. I want to step away for a moment from the political coverage of these pledges and look at the lived reality of them. So debt falling doesn't really affect us that much. Inflation halving does, in terms of our day-to-day experience. The cost of food is still going up. Poor old 30p Lee rather soiled himself on Twitter the other day by claiming that people were better off as a consequence of inflation coming down. And, of course, inflation means that your prices are still going up. So every day's a school day, I suppose, if you're 30p Lee. Hospital waiting lists, I would argue, are the most important and probably the biggest failure. And then stopping the boats, just such a mad policy. A pledge to undo damage done by a situation created entirely by his own party. So I've got in the back of my mind two questions, because I don't want to treat it as a completely funny exercise. So I want to know, what was the stupidest of those pledges? Or I'm going to say the most stupid, because I don't think stupidest is a word. Keith, is stupidest a word? Do we know? It is a word. Apparently, do you think stupidest is a word? Do you think stupidest is a word? Everyone thinks stupidest is a word. So we stick with stupidest, do we? Stupidest? So which of the 5 pledges was the stupidest? 0345 6060 973. Was it the pledge to halve inflation? Was it the pledge to grow the economy? Was it the pledge that debt would fall? The pledge to cut waiting lists? Or the pledge to stop the boats? So have a think about that. But on a more serious note, what's the most important of those pledges to you? To you personally, and then I want you to tell me why. So you don't have to answer both questions. You can answer the first question or the second question or both questions, but you can't answer no questions. What you cannot do, even on this parameter redefining phone-in show, you cannot ring in and answer none of the questions that have been asked. Although, seeing as it's the last hour of our time together this year, I'm not going to punish you if you try. 9 minutes after 12 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And the questions that I want you to answer are these. Which of Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges was, now that we've reached the end of the year in which he promised they would all be achieved, which is the stupidest? Is it the pledge to halve inflation, the pledge to grow the economy, the pledge to cut national debt, the pledge to cut waiting lists, or indeed the pledge to stop the boats? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Now, I'm gonna go first, and I'm going to be a bit controversial, actually. And I am going to say that the stupidest was actually the pledge to halve inflation, even though it's the only one, as far as I can tell, that he has achieved. And the reason for that is that it proved that his opinion of the British public was similar to the Daily Mail editor's opinion of Daily Mail readers. He really did think you were stupid enough to fall for the idea that governments bear no responsibility whatsoever for inflation going up, which I think he actually claimed on the record, nothing to do with us, while they can claim full responsibility when inflation actually goes down. So inflation largely seen as being independent of government policy went through the roof when Russia invaded Ukraine, largely because of the increased costs of both food that was making its way from that part of the world and, most crucially, energy. And as those situations have eased, so inflation has come down. So I think the stupidest one, politically speaking, was actually the inflation pledge, because not only did it demonstrate disingenuousness, but it also showed, do you know what it constituted? A bet on the stupidity of the British voting public. So it was both disingenuous and actually dishonest, because it wouldn't be his achievement even if it happened, but the fact that he thought you would believe that it would be his achievement even if it happened would speak to a very low opinion of his voters' intelligence, possibly justified. So that, for me, I'm going to keep proper charts. We're going to do this properly if you want to join in. So I'm going to do points on one side. I'm just describing to you now the piece of paper that I've got in front of me. So I'll write the 5 pledges on it, and then I'll put stupid on the left, important on the right, and you can vote for one or both or neither. The inflation halving, the economy growing, the debt falling, the waiting lists falling, and stop the boats. So what was the stupidest and what was the most important? So we've got one vote for inflation being the stupidest. And on the most important, I think I'm going to go with waiting lists on that, but I need to know from you, and this will be where the conversation moves very much into more serious territory. I want to know from you why the failure to cut the waiting list is so terrible for you and or your family. So the stupidest of the 5 pledges and the most important of the 5 pledges. So in a way, we're looking for the one he shouldn't have made and the one he really should have kept. That may even be a better way of looking at it. The one he shouldn't have made and the one he really should have kept. Halving inflation, growing the economy, bringing down debt, cutting the waiting lists, and or stopping the boats. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Let's kick off with Balama, who's in Lambeth. Balama, what's it going to be?
Hi, James. I thought the most important is obviously the waiting list. I attended a conference earlier this year at the... I'm trying to remember the name of the author who... Rodal, who wrote several books, and my children love his books. Yeah. So we went to his village, and at the conference, we were in a room of 7 in a breakout group, and 5 of us spoke about the NHS waiting list, and of the 5, 4 were on the waiting list.
Good grief.
And obviously, we know that the economy cannot grow when you have over 7 million people on the waiting list who cannot work.
It's amazing how rarely those dots are joined, isn't it? Because they've started talking about encouraging people who are unfit to work back to work, even while they remain unfit to work, and not talking about making sure that people who are currently too unfit to work because of illness or medical need get their medical needs addressed, and then they'll be able to go back to work again.
Yeah, absolutely. Telling people to go back to work when you know they cannot, including, for example, when they said they were going to encourage the disabled or those who have special needs to go back to work, but without putting anything in place to encourage employers to provide for them. We obviously know that it will cost employers more, but what he did, James, when the waiting list weren't going down, was that number one, he started blaming the NHS, saying it was because of the strikes, when we know that the waiting list was growing before the strikes, and then he said it was COVID. We know that it was growing before COVID. But remember,
No, I was just thinking it could be the stupidest pledge, as well as the most important, for the reasons that you've just reminded us of.
Yeah, but James, it is not the stupidest from Rishi Sunak's perspective, because when he saw that it was not going down, he walked back from the pledge. He didn't speak about it at the conference, if you remember. But the stupidest is Rwanda, because he kept taking steps that made it even more ridiculous after he made the initial pledge. He said he was going to stop the boats. They entered into the Rwanda agreement. His Home Office secretary was there saying that's the dream of her life. And then it didn't happen. They changed the law 3 times. They proposed bill 3 times. It did not work. He legislated reality to say that Rwanda was safe. I thought, James, he missed an opportunity there. If you can legislate reality and say Rwanda was safe, why don't you just go straight to the place and legislate that the small boats have stopped, even though they haven't stopped?
Don't stop there, Balama. You could pass legislation to say that the waiting list has been cut, debt has fallen, the economy has grown, and inflation has disappeared entirely.
Yeah, and I am doing everything, obviously, all of this because of the elections. The 2024 elections have held, and I have won. And so you can stay another 5 years.
I mean, we shouldn't joke. I mean, if they can pass legislation to make an unsafe country safe, maybe they can pass legislation to say that a waiting list isn't really a waiting list. Thank you, Balama. That's 2 excellent votes. One for waiting lists being the most important. That's now up to 2. I suspect that's going to be a runaway leader. But Stop the Boats getting a vote for being the stupidest. It's your turn to vote next on 0345 60 60 973. Great stuff. It's 12:17.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 18 minutes after 12. There were 5 pledges, all of which were supposed to be delivered by the end of this year. The year is essentially up, which has turned out to be the stupidest and which has turned out to be the most important. Halve inflation, grow the economy, cut debt, cut waiting lists, and stop the boats. And the competition is hopping up. Stan's in Overton. Are you looking out the window?
No, I'm not. No, why are you there?
No, I just thought that would be the Overton window, wouldn't it? What have you got for me, Stan?
So just my vote has got to be the stupidest is to cut the waiting list, while we all knew there was an ongoing wage situation with the NHS staff. Yes. And they was already on strikes. They already had planned strikes. They was already having to cancel operations.
Well, junior doctors were, but I don't know if we knew that the nurses were actually going to join them. So it got worse, not better.
Well, yes. I mean, it's to come out with that when you knew you had no intention of putting it and to do anything about the wages, and obviously, and then the most important, if you're going to halve inflation, you can't do both. You haven't served one purpose.
I like the way you're just laughing as you talk through this. I mean, there's not even any attempt at taking them seriously. It's just a sort of curious, like an amalgam of idiocy, which he thought somehow...
I can't take him serious, to be honest.
But did you at the time, though? Because, I mean, for a few minutes he seemed to be quite sensible, didn't he?
Well, I mean, let's put it down. I mean, he's somebody that would love to halve inflation, I'm sure, because it serves his purpose. He's one of the people luckily enough, and fair play to him, he's worked hard, to not have to actually worry so much about that.
And the most important?
Well, as I say, it's got to be the half inflation.
Sorry, yes, of course. Yeah, but that's not... No, yeah, all right. I don't know if I've explained, but it's not it can't be... So it's the most important thing that needed to happen.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something that he could control.
Well, I mean, you can't control everything, but I mean, to pledge it, then you have to have some sort of, confidence in what you're saying. Otherwise, it's just, just a load of lies. Which obviously...
you're right. Yeah, well, is it lies or is it less? Is it more? And what did he actually say at the time? The 5 pledges would deliver peace of mind, build a better future for the next generation. He told us he was going to work night and day to fulfil the promises. He also said he would detain those making illegal migrant crossings and insinuated tougher measures. So absolutely no doubt whatsoever that he was intending or promising that these things would have arrived in the United Kingdom by now. And I think it's fair to say that they haven't. I knew this wouldn't. My numbers are all over the place. You should see the state. Look at that. It looks like a drunk spider has fallen into an inkwell and then crawled across a piece of paper. As it stands, I've got waiting lists, 2 stupids and 2 importants for the waiting lists. 1 stupid for stop the boats, 1 stupid for inflation and 1 important for halving inflation, which means that I've counted wrong already. We've only had 3 votes and I've got 7. So I don't think anyone else... No, only Stan said that the waiting lists are important. I must have just doodled that while I was listening to him. Of course, there was another set of pledges that was issued at around the same time that Rishi Sunak issued his. Perhaps we could also double-check to see whether any of those pledges have been realised. That is my pledge. My pledges to you today are these. The sun will come up tomorrow. There'll be a full moon in the next month, possibly 2. An English team will win the FA Cup. It will rain before the next general election. And tomorrow, the Daily Mail will run an article, at least one article, again, I may over-deliver on this, that is critical of Harry and Meghan. And I want you to judge me according to these pledges. I want you to look at these pledges and tell me, let me get the words exactly right, they are your priorities, those are the people's priorities, and we will either have achieved them or not. It's 11 o'clock. So that line there, straight from Rishi Sunak, we will either have achieved them or not. What do you cling to as a Tory if you want to pretend that things haven't actually gone disastrously for him when he said we will either achieve them or not, and you've got 4 nots and not really on the inflation. It may have been halved, but it's fair to say that it wasn't much to do with him. Manchester City, wasn't it, the FA Cup, I think? So I got that one right. So there you go, 1 for 1. Did the sun come up the next day? So I made that pledge on the 5th of January 2023. The next day was actually Epiphany. I wonder whether you had an epiphany when the sun came up and thought, I wonder whether James's pledges are going to turn out to be rather more reliable than Rishi Sunak's. There was a negative story about Prince Harry and Meghan in the Mail on the 6th of January. There was a full moon between the 5th of January and the 5th of February, possibly 2. And I'm fairly confident that my pledges have turned out to be a lot more reliable than Rishi Sunak's. But what was his stupidest and what was his most important? Luke's in Chingford. Luke, what have you got? I've bored him to death by playing my own clips of myself. Is Luke there or not? Can we talk to Luke?
Hello.
Who's that?
It's Luke in Chingford.
Well, where were you?
I had you on mute.
You pardon?
I had myself on mute, sorry.
You had yourself on mute?
Yes.
Okay, well, welcome. What have you got for me?
I think the stupidest would be the halving inflation.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Tell me why. What are your reasons?
Well, what frustrates me is how it's covered in the news, I guess, both by the Conservative Party, but to a lesser extent also by journalists, which is that halving inflation, I would say, is a good thing. I'm not convinced how much the government's directly had to do with that, but once you're lapping high inflation in a year-on-year perspective, it probably has a good chance it's going to come down anyway.
Yep.
And for me, it doesn't address the fundamental issue that affects me and my family in the cost of living crisis, which is that for the period when inflation was in kind of high double digits and you had a lot of additional costs feeding into energy, rents, mortgage and food, that gap that has opened up between my salary and the monthly costs coming into my family, that gap does not get closed as long as inflation is still above zero.
No, that's a very good point. Of course it doesn't, unless your pay packet goes up by the same factor.
Yeah, and my pay rise, I think from memory was under 5%. So I'm paying, I think, about £300 a month extra in energy and mortgage costs compared to where I was 12, 18 months ago. So on the one hand, I'm grateful that the situation's not going to get any worse.
Yeah.
But from my perspective, my mortgage, I'm on a higher mortgage rate now, I think, for 5 years. And I don't really know when the energy prices are going to come down. And it just makes every month difficult in terms of making ends meet at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, crikey, that's actually a very grown-up analysis of what was essentially a fairly silly question, because that was the stupidest one. What's the most important one?
Well, probably NHS waiting lists would be the most important one for me. My recent kind of, when I've had to use the health service recently, I've not been blown away by the service that I've been receiving, and having people wait an inordinate length of time for. I mean, my dad, for example, had needed his hip replaced, and he was fortunate enough to have private health insurance, which I don't have private. Well, I don't have cover like my dad has.
Sure.
I just pity anyone that's waiting for an important operation like that on a very long waiting list.
And the government only really acknowledge their existence when the junior doctors are on strike or when the nurses are on strike. The rest of the time, it's out of sight and out of mind. Excellent votes from Luke, and I like Luke. Treating this with the seriousness that it deserves. What is Rishi Sunak's stupidest pledge? And what is his most important? As we come to the end of the year in which he promised that they would all be delivered in order to build a better future for the next generation, having worked night and day, these are all quotes, to fulfil the promises, he said back in January the 5th, 2023. Simon's in Huddersfield. Simon, take it away.
James.
Hello, mate.
Good morning. Happy Christmas.
Same to you.
Long time listening, and usually I listen to people saying, "Oh, they're not nervous," or "They are nervous," and I'm ordinarily not nervous, but I'm absolutely bricking it this morning. So
what? Just for this?
Yeah, just for this.
Oh,
I've tried
bless.
ringing loads of times, but you keep giving it another go, don't you?
Thank you. Carry on.
Do you know what? I think his stupidest claim or his stupidest pledge was the one he made when he first got into power about accountability, honesty, and integrity.
You can't. It's a sixth pledge. You can't. I mean, you're right. Actually, God. Oh, all right. We're going to have to put on a little side order, aren't we, of the accountability, professionalism, and are you suggesting that he hasn't delivered accountability, professionalism, and integrity, Simon?
Yeah, I kind of feel he hasn't. You know, he kind of smashed that one. Yeah, he's awful, isn't he? But I actually think the smartest pledge he put, and I'm going to kind of go against you on this one, is the halving inflation one.
Right.
And the reason for that is that...
Is that a dog? Is that a dog in the background?
It's one of the dogs. The blooming doorbell went.
Oh, no. Crikey.
I'm in a different room, so
that's
apologies.
All right. No, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't a fault on the line. The doorbell sends them potty. Go on. So I know what you're going to say next. If you're going against me, you're going to say that the inflation halving was the most important.
Yeah, and this is because we are in a country that still thinks that Boris, or a lot of people still think Boris got the big calls right, and get Brexit done. And, we are a politically illiterate country, and a lot of people will see and hear halving inflation, and they will think actually takes responsibility for it.
Well done, Rishi Sunak. So the same people who think that Keir Starmer has a case to answer for having been a barrister and doing some barristering when he was a barrister are the same people who might think that Rishi Sunak bears some responsibility for halving inflation,
take all the credit.
Despite the fact that I'm pretty sure he's on the record when it was very high for saying that had nothing to do with the government.
Yeah, but up is down and left is right with these set of spiffs. So what do you expect?
Nicely put, Simon. I bet your nerves have gone now, have they? Relaxed into it?
No, I'm still shaking like a...
Well, there you go. You never know, do you? You never know how it's going to affect you. Thank you. 12:30 is the time. Couple of phone lines free. You can grab Simon's as he vacates it. So we got inflation halving is currently 2-2, both the stupidest and the most important. So are the waiting lists. Hang on, what was his stupidest? What was Simon's stupidest, Keith? Were you paying attention? Is anyone else paying attention here? Is he still there? He's gone. What? They must have stopped the... Oh, I knew this wouldn't work. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:33. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are trying to work out what was the stupidest and what was the most important, or perhaps importantest, of Rishi Sunak's pledges. Thankfully, Derek is paying attention. I'm not sure anybody else is, but the last caller's suggestion for the stupidest was a new pledge. It wasn't actually one of the 5 pledges. It was the first pledge that preceded the 5 pledges. And the 5 pledges, of course, preceded the 7 bins. So it goes from the first pledge, accountability, professionalism and integrity. Actually, do you know the way to remember the order in which he said that? I can't remember who pointed this out to me. I forgot to read out the text at the time. The order he did it in was actually integrity, professionalism, accountability. And if you are, like me, quite fond of a pint of IPA, that becomes the easiest way to remember the order in which he said the 3 things that he would bring back to government: integrity, professionalism and accountability. So I don't know if we can add that. Do we add that to the list or do we... Ian's been in touch. Ian is a regular supplier of ice cream to the capital, who I sometimes bump into around the Covent Garden area in the mornings. He says, you always mess these poll things up. Please can I keep the scores next time you do one? Happy Christmas, mate. Well, happy Christmas to you as well. And happy Christmas to Derek, who remembered that, I think it was Simon, was it, the last caller? His accountability and integrity, professionalism and accountability has got 1 vote now. 2 each for inflation halving and waiting lists, and 1 on the stupid column for stop the boats. Steve's in Grimsby. Steve, what have you got?
Good afternoon, James.
Hello,
I've been wanting to speak for a long time.
Finally tempted you in.
Yeah, you are. Well, James, I've got so much admiration for you. I think the only error that you make is the same as mine. Is actually, if it is an error, is that you care. You're such a caring person, and the stuff that you talk about and the way that you analyse it is just truly amazing. Right. So the most stupidest thing was to say about inflation, because you're so right when I heard what you said maybe 5-10 minutes ago, that they'll take credit for the things when they've halved it, but they don't take credit, or they sweep under the carpet the things that pushed it there. Like, you remember Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng?
Yes.
And his wonderful attempts at trying to boost the economy, and he managed to put interest rates up by 5 or 6% in 2 months.
Yeah.
Genius.
Yeah, absolute genius. And then in he comes. So, yeah, well, I think there's no doubt about that. But it's weird that, because the people who think it's the most important are the ones who think that either it's really important that it happens, or it's important because people will fall for it. I'm not so sure they will. I think if they were going to fall for it, they would have done by now.
I don't know, James.
No,
I think people do fall for it. I mean, how did somebody IPA, which I thought was a fantastic analogy.
You'll never forget that now, will you? You'll never forget that.
It now. How did somebody like that, his predecessor bar 2 with Liz Truss? How did Johnson ever get into power?
Well, I've written a book about that, Steve, which you've given me a wonderful opportunity to mention. There you go. That's available in all good bookshops at the moment.
Yeah.
In fact, particularly...
Well, I'll put it on my Christmas list.
You should do, yeah. It'll be coming down your chimney on Christmas Eve. And the most important one?
Personal to me, James, is waiting list. My wife went through cancer during lockdown.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But, no, James, the service that she got and the compassion and care of the NHS were just amazing, and she's made a full recovery.
Oh, good.
What I worry about is what's going to happen for the people who are coming in, and for them then to say that the waiting lists are longer because of the actions of the doctors and the specialists is just so disingenuous.
It's horrible, isn't it? It's really horrible.
I cannot believe how foul that is. And, they ought to come round and see these people.
Yeah, I think you're right.
At work, and the compassion and care they've got.
That's brilliantly put, beautifully put. Merry Christmas to you and your wife, Steve.
Thank you, James, and to you and all your family. And keep up the good work.
I have to. Our kids need shoes. Thank you, Steve. That's 4 now. Waiting list. I told you they'd be runaway leaders on this, but the other it's going to be quite close for stupidest. Inflation halving. Waiting lists have got 2 stupids as well, and only 1 Stop the Boats. I thought Stop the Boats might be a contender for the stupidest, actually, but what do I know? Mark's in Mill Hill. Mark, what do you reckon?
Well, I'm going to vote against everybody else.
Good.
Basically, the stupidest, most asinine, most ill-founded one was cutting public debt, cutting the debt. And the reason for that is you can't cut... If you've got... A lot of our public debt is down to public interest payments. So the interest payments on the debt are geared to the interest rate.
Yes.
So if you're going to put up interest rates in order to solve inflation...
Well, they're not in charge of that, though, are they?
Well, yeah, but you know that's going to if you're going to say that your policy of cutting inflation by using interest rates as the key weapon is successful, then you're kind of taking...
There's a sort of economic... You're describing a form of economic illiteracy, I think, aren't you? Really?
Yes.
Which you wouldn't expect from a former Goldman Sachs man.
Maybe. So that's kind of... And then obviously making that pledge on growing the economy was not going to be possible if you're having to put up interest rates. So I think cutting the debt was... that was also economically illiterate, or selling an economically illiterate thing, because people confuse the debt, which is £2.5 trillion or whatever it is,
give or take,
with the deficit, which is the annual deficit, and even the annual deficit for this year is, I think, higher than it was last year. I think
we'd have to check. So that's for Stu. What's most important?
I think growing the economy.
Yeah. Well, he's not done that, has he?
And he hasn't done that either. So it's
an extraordinary year. I wonder whether anybody thought at the time it would actually go as badly as it's gone. You probably would have given him 2 out of 3. I remember all the newspapers did like roundups of likelihood, almost doing odds checkers on what was likely to happen and what wasn't likely to happen. He's completely, if we were football commentators, Mark, I'd turn to you now and go, he's completely carked it, Mark.
And as you and I have discussed before, a couple of weeks ago, there's no guarantee that inflation is going to stay down, by the way. So I would be very, very careful of any promises made by
Rishi Sunak. I'd say, I mean, crikey, I'm glad I'm not on his Christmas present list, because whatever he said he was going to get you'd probably find yourself unwrapping an empty box come Christmas morning. Thank you, Mark. 12:41 is the time. Andrew in Edinburgh says, I bet you're the type who forgets the score during games of 5-a-side. You may have a point there, Andrew. He goes, stupidest inflation, most important waiting lists. I'll put that down, actually. I'll take votes from texts as well, and I think that the growing the economy is actually correct. You grow the economy and everything else follows. The problem is this lot think that don't quite understand the relationship, as Mark has just pointed out, between all the other factors as well. Let's go to Liverpool next. Maria is there. Maria, stupidest and most important, please.
Hi, James.
Hello.
Okay, the stupidest is the inflation.
Yeah.
And not stupid from him, stupid that he thinks we are stupid.
Yeah.
We've had 2 things this year. We've had greedflation and we've had shrinkflation. So when he called all the manufacturers in the summer and said, get the prices down, what they did was reduce the volume of their products. And that's when, if you go to the shop, none of these people ever go to a supermarket and shop.
They must do. I know what you mean. They must. Well, I mean...
They can't do. A loaf of bread, right, was £1 last year, now £1.45, but about a month ago, it went down by about a third. So not only has it gone up 45% since last year, it's gone down by a third. And that's happened to so many groceries in the shops. So you've got greedflation and shrinkflation. So all this inflation has gone down. It's just a load of absolute nonsense. The value you get for the money that you had last year is half of what you get this year, basically.
Yes, that makes sense.
Okay. So that's the stupidest. The most important is the NHS and that's on. That's a double whammy. Not only have you got the people who want to work, who could help the economy by working, but can't work because they're waiting for treatment, you've got their carers as well.
This is true.
So you've got all the
It's mad, isn't it?
people-
It would fix up so much, so many other problems. It's all the long-term stuff that would fix. He wants all his hits in the short term, but in fact, improving the country involves focusing on the long term. So pledges, even in and of themselves, are a daft idea, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Excuse me, but
That's
no.
all right. Steady on.
I've got nervous now.
Well, was
James.
that a
I've
cough?
got all nervous.
Was that a cough or a sneeze? Was that a cough?
That was a cough.
It was a cough. Well, it sounded like a sneeze. Well, we've done that.
that
We've
was
done
a
the
cough.
waiting lists. I hope it's nothing serious, because it'll be 3 years before they can see you.
James, it's talking to you. My Christmas wish has come true. You have a wonderful Christmas.
You too, Maria. Thank you so much. Ho, ho, ho. David, thank you. That was lovely. David's in Birmingham. David, what's it going to be?
Hi, James.
Hello,
first off, I saw you last week at the Oh God What Now Christmas shindig,
yes.
so I'm one of those weirdos that ring into radio shows.
Don't blow my cover like that. Jeez. Holy moly. That was a good night, wasn't it? That was a great
brilliant.
night.
Absolutely superb, and it was great to meet a few of the regulars afterwards as well, which was great.
Excellent.
Absolute pleasure. For me, the worst of his pledges is the one around inflation, and it's actually a little bit different to what other people have been saying.
Go on.
What's the lever that is used to bring inflation down?
Go on.
Interest rates.
Yes, of course, which is set by the Bank of England.
Which is set by the Bank of England, which is independent, theoretically.
Yeah.
So it's
really bad, that, isn't it? It's really disingenuous.
Really bad. Yeah, totally. I mean, yes, disingenuous is a polite way of putting what I'd put. I just think he's a liar. But there we go.
Fair enough.
So that.
And then the most important.
For me, it's the NHS. I'm on waiting list. So I've got plenty of things wrong with me. That's close. No, it's fine. I mean, it's nothing serious. So,
okay.
But it's one of those things where it is frustrating, and it doesn't stop me. But it leads to so much others, as other people have said previously very eloquently. If they want people to work, you've got to make sure they're fit enough to work.
And of course, by not negotiating in good faith with the BMA, they've made it worse. And although the nurses are only on a kind of wait and see pie, they're not. I don't think they've ruled out any future actions yet. So, and of course, again, we need to remind ourselves this is England and Wales. The Scottish government has somehow managed to perform better on some of these measures, but they've made it worse, not better. That was the maddest thing about the waiting list pledges. They must have known that the workforce was not only fleeing in numbers, but buckling under the strains that were already in place.
Absolutely, but they do it across the piece. Think about people are using the railway less, and why is that? It's because you can't guarantee that there's going to be a service. And why is that? Because
you're absolutely. Did you come up to Euston then?
Yeah, I came through Euston, but I got
lucky.
back. I got back on the Sunday, and it was fine. The only delay was actually caused by trespassers on the line near Rugby.
We can't blame Rishi Sunak for that.
Not even I can blame Rishi Sunak for that. But it's interesting what you just said there about bad faith actors, and I think this all goes back really to. I mean, you could take it back to Johnson and the negotiations with the EU and bad faith acting within that, and everything they've done since. And
has been set. The tone has been set.
The tone has been set. There has been no change. I think the thing with Sunak is just because he wears a nice suit and speaks quietly and has that public skill debate.
I don't agree with you. His suits aren't very nice.
But they're bespoke.
Probably.
They're real fitting. They're real fitting.
They are real fitting. They're halfway down his calves.
Well, they are, but that's to try and make him look taller, isn't it?
I don't think that works. Is that a thing? Is that a thing? If you wear your trousers at half mast, you look taller.
That's the only thing I can think of, because he's,
the producer agrees with you, and she's very short. It's 12:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10-1. I don't know if you were listening on Wednesday. Something quite special happened when we were talking about the relationship between environment and aspiration as a sort of form of you can't be what you can't see, and talking about overcoming adversity. And Fatima Whitbread rang in, the legendary athlete, and I thought I knew some elements of her life story, but even the brief snapshot that she gave us during the course of that call about her early years in care were absolutely breathtaking. And amazingly, that very night, because she rang us from the car on her way to the BBC Sports Personality of the Year Awards, but she knew, but we didn't, that she was due to pick up the Helen Rollason Award for a triumph in the face of adversity. And it was an incredibly moving scene, and it just, I don't know why, I bet you felt the same. I felt a bit proprietary. I thought, oh, she was just on the show today and now she's picking up that wonderful award. That was on Tuesday. Yesterday we both found time. Well, it makes it sound like I've got a packed schedule. Fatima very kindly found the time to come and talk to me for this week's Full Disclosure, which will be the final one of the year, and which I think, and when you've listened to it, you will probably agree, it's got to be a contender for the best of the year as well.
I'd been abandoned as a baby, and some would say left to die. I mean, a neighbour heard a baby crying in a flat, and she hadn't seen anybody coming or going for a couple of days, so she called the police and they banged the door down, rescued the baby, which was myself, and then spent the next 6 months recovering from malnutrition and nappy rash. And during that period, Hackney Borough Council made me a ward of court, and then I spent the next 14 years of my life in children's homes.
When were you first told that story? When did you first hear that?
Well, like all care leavers, you have the opportunity to be able to pick up your papers, which is what I wanted to do from Somerset House, and find out more about what was my background, my history, and which often the case a lot of these young children like to know.
Yes, of course.
Some of it's good and some of it's not so good, and I'm also very keen to make sure that some of these children, when they go and get their papers, they've got somebody that can sit with them.
Yes.
Because there's a lot for them. Some of it's a shock,
yeah.
When they find out what's gone on in their lives and why they were sort of left to go in homes or being fostered, and that's hard to process. But for me, it wasn't that difficult. I kind of lived that life for 14 years, and I knew that there wasn't really anybody out there. The biological mum, and I call it the biological mum because for the first 5 years of my life, I lived in Hertfordshire, and I had no communication whatsoever, and nobody sat me down and said, look, this is the reason why you're in care. And I think that's the most difficult thing for a young child, to process that, and their minds start thinking, they get trapped in their head like a prison. And yes, they arrive in care with a particular set of issues, emotional trauma, abandonment, neglect, and trust issues as well. And and that's, as I said, there's no fault of their own. And then, of course, back in the 60s, there's always a stigmatisation with children that lived in the care system. They must be the naughty kids, that's why they're in the homes. Well, in actual fact, no, it's not. And for me, it was no different. And so it was a tough old period of time whilst in the children's home. There were 25 other kids there, James. And I can remember always playing in the front room, and anybody that faced the car park. Yeah. And anybody that came in, I would always say, is that my mummy coming to get me? Which is, quite...
So you're conscious of what you haven't got, but you don't know why.
Absolutely.
Incredible stuff. And Fatima, as she explained on Tuesday, now pretty much dedicating her life to helping children who are in care. When she gets on to talking about that, this happens sometimes in long interviews. I'm sure you've noticed it in the past. There's a different mood in the room. And when a guest gets onto a subject about which they are passionate, it's almost like someone's turned the light up in the studio, not the volume necessarily, but the light. There's a level of animation, and when Fatima gets onto the subject of working tirelessly now to help children still in care, because there's more children in care today than there was when she was in the 70s, the 60s. She just illuminated the entire studio. You can watch it as well, of course, on YouTube, or you can listen to the podcast wherever you get your podcast at Global Player. But I do want to direct you also to the campaign that she is now running, which is called Fatima's Campaign. The website is fatimascampaign.com. So obviously no apostrophes or anything like that. So Fatima's Campaign, as you'd expect it to be spelt, .com. And you can go there, you can make donations to help support the work that she's doing. You can find out a lot more about it. Find out even, and I think you might want to do this after listening to the interview, if you don't already, how you might be able to help in some way, shape or form. Because I'll tell you now, that woman is on a mission. and she was 14 years old when she embarked upon a mission to become the best javelin thrower in the world. She achieved that mission. I would not bet against her achieving this mission as well, but find out more about it there at fatimascampaign.com. Couple of minutes left, couple more calls. Philip's in Hartlepool. Stupidest pledge and most important pledge, please, Philip.
I'll go most important first. The NHS, for all the obvious reasons.
It's romped home, the NHS.
Yeah,
There's no competition.
Yeah, and stupidest one, the boats, because nobody's mentioned Brexit so far.
That's true.
We're out of the European Union. It's only an issue that's going to be resolved with other countries.
Proper cooperation.
Proper cooperation and stuff. And
it's a stupid one as well. Well, the thing I find stupidest about that one is that it hasn't even appeased the idiots that it was designed to appease.
Yeah. Other than the lucrative trade in second-hand outboard motors that must be going on in Dover and places. The other thing is Sunak was in the select committee the other day.
Yeah, that's right.
With all the chairs of all the select committees.
Yes.
And he was asked by all of them, had he met these pledges? And the arrogance of the man was to answer, well, the year's not over yet.
Cheeky beggar.
So are you jumping the gun? Because there's another 9 days and Christmas miracles could happen.
It could all come good in the next night. We should have got that clip ready. Well, you should be on the team. This takes us back to Jason's suggestion that we start having regular meetings in the Red Lion. It's quite far for you to come from Hartlepool, put together some sort of plan for the new year. In fact, I forgot to do all of the other suggestions for New Year's resolutions. Let me see if I can find a couple of them. Ian says you should try to sound less sarcastic when reciting the LBC official texts. I don't know what he's talking about, Sheila.
I live for that.
I know. I couldn't imbue them with any more energy.
I live for it.
I could even if I tried.
I read it like the speaking clock.
That's a good way. I might try that as well. No more quotes from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Less verbosity and more plain English, and no book plugging. Well, Jonathan, I'm afraid 3 out of 3. I'm not going to be doing any of them in the new year. Quite the opposite. And finally, have a manifesto. Pick a subject, then take calls, get an informed answer and put it in your manifesto. I quite like that from Roy. We can assemble a show manifesto. Last word on this. Roundup of Rishi's pledges goes to Toby in Chiswick. Toby, what's it going to be?
Merry Christmas, James. Merry Christmas.
Same to you.
And I actually disagreeing with you. I think the daftest pledge he made was to grow the economy.
Yeah.
Because I don't actually think he hasn't managed to do it, and it's probably the one thing that he's had
most easily measurable, the most visible failure, probably.
Yeah,
will be that.
It's the last working day before Christmas, and there's gloomy, news about recession.
Every report is about the economy shrinking. I'm only hurrying you because I've only just glanced at the clock. What is the most important?
I think it has to be the waiting list, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Not for me personally, but for
it's way ahead of the field. I think that's got 10 votes. Inflation coming in far ahead. I thought it would be stop the boats. I hope I didn't skew it by picking inflation first and then setting the tone for the conversation. But that is it from me for another day and indeed for another year. I listen, I tell you all the time how much I love you, but at this time of year, I think it's important to, not you, Keith, I'm talking to the people listening to the programme. It's been a very special year in very, very many ways, and none of this ever would happen without you. So thank you very much indeed. I will be back on Boxing Day for a Christmas special alongside Sheila Fogarty and Ian Dale. It's going out at 5 a.m. and then again at 1 p.m. That's on Boxing Day. You can listen to it twice. It'd be like watching Neighbours in the old days. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back to the whole show. I'm going to do it with a bit more. I'm going to sound sarcastic. On Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. You'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcast, including Full Disclosure, with the amazing Fatima Whitbread this week. So pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now, with a very Merry Christmas from me, it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
And a very Merry Christmas to you as well, James. Have a great time. I'll see you in the new year.
James O'Brien on LBC.